Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're cracking open the life of a man you've seen 1,000 times, on dollar bills, in marble, on classroom walls, but never actually met. George Washington. Father of a nation, yes, but also a guy who loved dancing, lost his temper more than you'd think, and married one of the richest women in Virginia under, let's say, forget the statue. Tonight we're meeting the man, with all his passions, contradictions, and secrets that never made it into your history book. So hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there, and let's see how far this story travels tonight. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's peel back 200 years of legend. Ready? Let's go. So let's rewind the clock to the Virginia colony of the 1750s, a place where ambition wore powdered wigs and social climbing required actual horseback riding. Our young George Washington, at this point in his mid-20s, was not yet the marble-faced legend we know today. He was instead a somewhat gangly, remarkably tall young man with reddish-brown hair, a complexion scarred by smallpox, and a burning desire to become somebody. And in colonial Virginia, becoming somebody meant one of two things: inheriting land or marrying into it. George unfortunately had drawn the short straw on inheritance. His older half-brother Lawrence had gotten the lion's share of the family estate, and when Lawrence died, George found himself managing Mount Vernon as a tenant rather than an owner. Not exactly the position of power he had envisioned for himself. Now before we get to Martha, we need to talk about the woman who complicated everything, a certain Sally Carey Fairfax. And this is where our story takes a turn that your elementary school textbook conveniently forgot to mention. Sally was, by all accounts, one of the most captivating women in Virginia society. She was witty, educated, charming, and possessed of that particular kind of intelligence that made powerful men feel simultaneously brilliant and slightly inadequate in her presence. She was also, rather inconveniently, married to George William Fairfax, one of Washington's closest friends and neighbours. The Fairfax family was colonial aristocracy, wealthy, connected, and occupying the highest rungs of Virginia's social ladder. George Washington, ambitious young surveyor and military officer that he was, had cultivated a close relationship with this family. Whether he initially sought their company for social advancement or genuine friendship is one of those questions historians love to debate over lengthy dinners. What is not debatable, however, is that George Washington fell deeply, painfully, and hopelessly in love with Sally Fairfax. The evidence lies in his letters, particularly one written in 1758 that would make any modern relationship counsellor reach for the smelling salts. In this letter, penned while he was engaged to Martha and Sally was very much still married to his friend, Washington confessed his feelings with the kind of tortured eloquence that suggests he had been practicing in front of a mirror. He wrote of an unnamed woman who had drawn him to love, of feelings he had struggled to contain, of a passion that persisted despite his best efforts to extinguish it. The letter dances around direct confession with the grace of a man who knows he is writing something he probably should not, but cannot help himself. Scholars have debated the exact meaning of his words for centuries, but the general consensus is that George Washington, future father of a nation, was carrying a torch for his best friend's wife while preparing to marry another woman entirely. This was not, it should be noted, an unusual situation for the times. Colonial Virginia operated on a social code that would seem bewildering to modern sensibilities. Marriages among the gentry were primarily economic and social arrangements. Love, if it happened to develop, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than a prerequisite. A wealthy widow with children and property was not a romantic prospect. She was a business opportunity. And Martha Dandridge Custis was, by any measure, one of the finest business opportunities in the entire colony. Let us pause here to properly introduce Martha, who deserves far more than a supporting role in her own love story. Born Martha Dandridge in 1731, she was the eldest daughter of a moderately prosperous planter. Her family was respectable but not wealthy, comfortable but not powerful. In colonial terms, she was solidly middle class, which meant she could expect to marry someone of similar station and live a life of quiet respectability. Fate, however, had other plans. At 18, Martha married Daniel Park Custis, a man 20 years her senior who happened to be one of the wealthiest planters in Virginia. The marriage was considered a spectacular match for young Martha, the equivalent of a small-town girl marrying a billionaire, except the billionaire came with significantly more land and significantly fewer yachts. The Custis marriage appears to have been genuinely happy, which was not always a given in arrangements made primarily for financial considerations. Daniel was wealthy enough to indulge his young wife, and Martha proved herself an exceptionally capable manager of their household. They had 4 children together, though only 2, John Park Custis, called Jackie, and Martha Parke Custis, called Patsy, survived infancy. Then, in 1757, Daniel Parke Custis died suddenly, leaving Martha a widow at 26 with 2 small children and an enormous fortune. The scale of Martha's inheritance deserves some attention here, because it explains a great deal about what happened next. When Daniel died, Martha became one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. She inherited approximately 17,000 acres of land, nearly 300 enslaved people, and a cash fortune that would be worth millions in modern currency. She also inherited something equally valuable in colonial society: complete legal control over her own affairs. As a widow, Martha could own property, conduct business, and make decisions without male oversight. This was not a small thing in an era when married women had roughly the same legal standing as furniture. Martha Custis, widow, was a free agent in a society that rarely allowed women such autonomy. Naturally, the eligible bachelors of Virginia descended upon her like particularly well-dressed vultures. A wealthy widow was expected to remarry quickly. Managing a large estate was considered men's work, and besides, a woman of means needed protection from fortune hunters. The irony that the protectors were often fortune hunters themselves seems to have been lost on colonial society. Martha received numerous proposals and plenty of attention. She was not, it should be said, considered a great beauty by the standards of her time. Contemporary descriptions paint her as short, plump, and pleasant-looking rather than stunning. But she had something far more attractive than conventional beauty. She had money, land, and the proven ability to run a profitable plantation. In the marriage market of colonial Virginia, Martha Custis was a prize worth pursuing. Enter George Washington, stage left, with ambitions larger than his bank account. The exact circumstances of their first meeting are lost to history, though we know it occurred sometime in early 1758. Washington was at this point a colonel in the Virginia militia, having made a name for himself in the French and Indian War with a mixture of genuine bravery and spectacular bad luck. His military career had given him status and connections, but not wealth. He was still managing Mount Vernon on a lease, still struggling to establish himself among Virginia's elite, still watching men with larger inheritances enjoy the privileges he craved. What he needed was capital, and Martha Custis had capital in abundance. Their courtship was, by all accounts, remarkably brief. Washington visited Martha at her plantation White House in March 1758. He visited again in June. By then, they were engaged. The entire courtship lasted approximately 3 months, during which time Washington was also actively engaged in military campaigns and, as we have discussed, writing tortured love letters to another woman. This does not suggest a man swept away by romantic passion. It suggests Martha, for her part, seems to have approached the matter with similar pragmatism. She was a wealthy widow who needed a husband to help manage her estate and provide a father figure for her children. Washington was tall, distinguished, ambitious, and came with good social connections. If he was not the wealthiest suitor, he was certainly the most promising. The wedding took place on January 6, 1759, at White House Plantation. It was, by colonial standards, a modest affair. No elaborate ceremony, no lengthy guest list, just a legal union that would reshape both of their lives. Martha brought to the marriage her vast fortune, her 2 children, and her considerable domestic skills. George brought his military reputation, his social ambitions, and his burning desire to become one of Virginia's leading citizens. It was in every sense a partnership formed from mutual advantage. What neither of them could have predicted was that this practical arrangement would evolve into one of the most enduring marriages in American history. Now let us address the elephant in the room, or rather the Sally in the drawing room. Did George Washington marry Martha while still in love with Sally Fairfax? Almost certainly yes. Did he continue to harbour feelings for Sally throughout his marriage? The evidence suggests he did, though the nature of those feelings evolved over time. Washington kept Sally's letters until the day he died, a rather telling detail for a man who carefully curated his public image. When Sally and her husband moved permanently to England in 1773, Washington wrote her letters that, while more restrained than his earlier confessions, still carried an undercurrent of emotion that went beyond mere friendship. Late in his life, in 1798, he wrote to Sally, now an elderly widow living in England, expressing sentiments that scholars continue to debate. Some see it as the final chapter of an unrequited love story. Others see it as an old man indulging in nostalgia for his youth. The truth, as with most human emotions, probably lies somewhere in between. But here is the thing about the Washington marriage that often gets lost in discussions of Sally Fairfax and calculations of colonial economics. Somewhere along the way, George and Martha fell in love. Not the passionate, tortured love that George felt for Sally, but something deeper, more sustainable, and ultimately more meaningful. The evidence lies not in dramatic letters or grand gestures, but in the small details of their 40-year partnership. Washington referred to Martha as "my dear Patsy" in his letters, using her childhood nickname with evident affection. He worried about her health, valued her counsel, and consistently chose her company over all others when given the option. Martha, for her part, followed her husband through the hardships of the Revolutionary War, spending winters in military camps when she could have remained comfortably at home. This was not the behaviour of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage of convenience. The transformation of the Washington marriage from practical arrangement to genuine partnership appears to have happened gradually, though the exact timeline is impossible to determine. They had no children together, a source of private grief for both of them, though they never discussed it publicly. This childlessness meant that their relationship had to stand on its own merits, without the binding force of shared offspring. In some ways, this may have strengthened their bond. They were partners in the truest sense, working together to build Mount Vernon into one of Virginia's finest estates, navigating the social complexities of colonial life, and eventually facing the extraordinary challenges of revolution and nation-building as a team. It is worth pausing here to consider what daily life looked like for the Washingtons in those early years of marriage. George, finally in possession of the wealth and social standing he had long craved, threw himself into the work of becoming a gentleman planter. He expanded Mount Vernon, experimented with new agricultural techniques, and carefully cultivated relationships with Virginia's most influential families. Martha managed the household with the same efficiency she had demonstrated at White House, overseeing a domestic operation that included dozens of enslaved workers, multiple buildings, and the constant stream of visitors that colonial hospitality demanded. The Washingtons were rarely alone. Virginia plantation life was essentially one continuous house party, with relatives, friends, and acquaintances arriving for visits that could last weeks or even months. Within this whirlwind of social activity, George and Martha carved out a partnership that defied easy categorization. Martha was not merely a hostess or a household manager, she was a business partner, a confidant, and an advisor. Washington discussed plantation matters with her, sought her opinion on social situations, and relied on her judgment in ways that were unusual for the era. This was not a marriage where the husband made decisions and the wife obeyed. This was a collaboration between two intelligent, capable people who had learned to respect each other's strengths. The letters between George and Martha during their periods of separation provide the clearest window into their relationship, and here we encounter one of history's great frustrations. Martha Washington, upon her husband's death, burned nearly all of their personal correspondence. She kept only 2 letters, and those by apparent accident. This destruction was deliberate. Martha understood that her husband had become a public figure, and she wished to preserve some privacy for their intimate life. Historians have been mourning this loss ever since. What we are left with are the letters that survive through other means, copies kept by secretaries, letters to third parties that mention their relationship, and the handful of notes that escaped Martha's bonfire. From these fragments, we can piece together a picture of genuine affection. George's letters to Martha during the Revolutionary War are filled with expressions of longing and concern. He worried about her health, apologized for the hardships his absence caused, and expressed his desire to return to her side. Martha's letters to him, of which almost none survive, apparently matched his tone. We know this because George's responses clearly indicate he was receiving warm, affectionate correspondence. This was not the formal correspondence of a business arrangement. This was the communication of 2 people who genuinely missed each other. But let us return to those early years, to the 1760s when the Washingtons were establishing their life together, and revolution was still a distant thundercloud on the horizon. George, having achieved his goal of wealth and status through marriage, might have been expected to rest on his laurels. Instead, he worked harder than ever. Mount Vernon became his obsession, a canvas on which he painted his vision of the ideal Virginia estate. He experimented with new crops, imported exotic plants, and kept meticulous records of every agricultural endeavour. Martha supported these efforts while managing her own domain, the house itself, with its constant demands of cooking, cleaning, entertaining, and child-rearing. The children, Jackie and Patsy, complicated the Washington household in ways both predictable and unexpected. George stepped into the role of stepfather with characteristic determination, if not always with natural ease. He was not a man who related easily to children. His temperament was too controlled, his expectations too high. Jackie in particular proved a challenge. The boy had been spoiled by his wealthy upbringing and showed little interest in the discipline and education that Washington valued. Their relationship would be marked by tension and disappointment, a subject we will explore more fully later. Patsy, the daughter, was easier to love, sweet-tempered and affectionate, but her epilepsy cast a shadow over the household that deepened with each passing year. Martha navigated these family dynamics with considerably more grace than her husband. She understood her children in ways George never quite managed, and she served as a buffer between his exacting standards and their youthful imperfections. This mediating role would become one of her most important contributions to the marriage. Martha was the soft edge to George's hard corners, the warmth that balanced his reserve. Without her, Washington might have been respected but not beloved. With her, he became something more human, more approachable, more capable of inspiring genuine loyalty rather than mere obedience. The social life of the Washingtons in these years was relentless. Virginia gentry society operated on an elaborate system of visits, dinners, balls, and entertainments that consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. George, despite his natural reserve, understood the importance of these social rituals and participated fully. Martha excelled at them. She had a gift for putting people at ease, for managing the complex logistics of hospitality, and for remembering the details about guests that made them feel valued. Together they became one of Virginia's premier host couples, their home a destination for anyone who wanted to see and be seen in colonial society. Yet beneath this glittering social surface, both Washingtons harboured private griefs and unfulfilled longings. Their childlessness was never discussed publicly, but it clearly weighed on both of them. In an era when children were both an economic necessity and a social expectation, the absence of a biological heir was a source of shame and sadness. George poured his paternal energies into Jackie and Patsy, with mixed results. Martha, who had already lost 2 children in infancy, must have felt the absence keenly. Their shared grief over this unfulfilled desire may have been another bond that drew them closer together, a private sorrow that only they fully understood. The question of why they had no children together has occupied historians and medical professionals for generations. Some have speculated that Washington was sterile, possibly as a result of the various illnesses he suffered throughout his life. Smallpox, dysentery, tuberculosis, malaria, and a host of other ailments that ravaged his body at various points. Others have suggested that Martha's difficult pregnancies and childbirths may have left her unable to conceive again. Still others have proposed that the stress and separations of their life together simply prevented successful conception. The truth is unknowable, but the impact was significant. Without children of their own, George and Martha Washington built a different kind of legacy, one based on public service rather than private dynasty. As the 1760s progressed, the political situation in the colonies began to shift in ways that would eventually consume Washington's life and transform his marriage. The Stamp Act of 1765 sparked protests throughout the colonies, and George Washington, gentleman planter, militia veteran, and aspiring member of the Virginia elite, found himself drawn into political discussions that would have seemed radical just a few years earlier. Martha watched as her husband's interests expanded beyond agriculture and social advancement to encompass questions of liberty, representation, and colonial rights. Whether she shared his growing political convictions or simply supported him out of wifely loyalty, she stood beside him as he moved from private citizen to public figure. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Washington was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he served quietly but attentively, absorbing the lessons of political maneuvering that would serve him well in years to come. He corresponded with other colonial leaders, attended meetings, and slowly built the network of relationships that would make him a natural choice for leadership when revolution finally came. Martha supported these endeavours without complaint, managing Mount Vernon during his absences and providing the stable home base that allowed him to pursue public ambitions. Through it all, the marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement continued to deepen into something more profound. The shared experiences of building a life together, the joys and sorrows, the successes and failures, the daily intimacies of partnership created bonds that transcended the initial calculations of wealth and status. George Washington, who had once written tortured letters about his love for another woman, found in Martha a companion who suited him in ways Sally Fairfax never could have. Sally was a romantic fantasy, an impossible love that could never be tested by the realities of daily life. Martha was real, present, capable, loyal, and increasingly essential to Washington's sense of himself. This is not to suggest that their marriage was without conflicts or difficulties. Washington's perfectionism and controlling nature must have been challenging to live with. His expectations for himself and others were impossibly high, and his temper, though carefully controlled in public, was known to flare in private. Martha, for all her sweetness, was no pushover. She had managed one of Virginia's largest estates as a widow, and was accustomed to having her opinions respected. Their partnership required negotiation, compromise, and mutual accommodation in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated when they exchanged vows in 1759. The economic aspects of their union also required careful management. Under colonial law, Martha's property became George's upon marriage, a transfer of wealth that made Washington one of Virginia's richest men overnight. But George was careful to treat this inheritance with respect, maintaining separate accounts for the Custis estate and ensuring that Martha's children would receive their full share upon reaching adulthood. This was not legally required of him, and many husbands of the era simply absorbed their wives' fortunes without any such scruples. Washington's careful stewardship of the Custis inheritance suggests both his fundamental honesty and his understanding that the marriage was a partnership rather than a conquest. Martha, for her part, never showed any indication that she resented this legal transfer of her property. She had chosen to remarry, knowing full well what colonial law required, and she trusted her new husband to manage their combined estates responsibly. This trust was not misplaced. Washington proved to be an excellent manager of the Custis properties, maintaining their value and ensuring that Jackie and Patsy would inherit substantial fortunes when they came of age. Whatever else can be said about the Washington marriage, it was characterized by mutual trust and financial transparency, not small achievements in an era when many marriages were battlegrounds of economic exploitation. As we consider the nature of George and Martha's relationship, it is worth reflecting on what marriage meant in 18th century Virginia. The romantic ideals that dominate modern thinking about marriage, passion, emotional intimacy, personal fulfillment, were largely foreign to colonial sensibilities. Marriage was first and foremost an economic and social institution, designed to consolidate property, produce heirs, and maintain social order. Love was nice if it happened, but it was not the primary purpose of matrimony. Within this context, the Washington marriage was considered an unqualified success. It brought together two compatible people, consolidated substantial wealth, and created a household that functioned smoothly and hospitably. That it also produced genuine affection and partnership was a bonus, not a requirement. Yet the Washingtons achieved something that transcended the utilitarian expectations of their era. They built a marriage that was genuinely happy, not just successful. The evidence lies in George's consistent expressions of affection for Martha, in her willingness to follow him through the hardships of war, in their apparent contentment in each other's company after decades together. This was not a marriage of resigned acceptance or grim duty. This was a partnership of genuine mutual regard, built slowly over years of shared experience and gradually deepening affection. The shadow of Sally Fairfax never entirely disappeared, but it faded over time into something more like nostalgia than active longing. Washington's feelings for Sally represented the road not taken, the romantic ideal that could never be tested against reality. Martha represented the choice he actually made, and it was a choice that he never seems to have regretted. Whatever passion he may have felt for Sally, his commitment to Martha was absolute. He never gave any indication of straying from his marriage vows, never sought romantic companionship outside his union, never wavered in his loyalty to the woman who had become his partner in everything. Martha's feelings about Sally Fairfax and about her husband's earlier attachment are entirely unknown. She left no record of jealousy, resentment, or concern about this other woman. Perhaps she did not know the extent of George's feelings. Perhaps she was confident enough in her own relationship with George to feel unthreatened by a rival who had been safely married to someone else all along. We will never know, because Martha Washington guarded her private feelings even more carefully than she guarded her correspondence. What we do know is that the marriage endured, grew stronger, and ultimately became the emotional foundation upon which Washington built his extraordinary public career. When revolution came, Martha was there. When he was named commander of the Continental Army, Martha was there. When he was elected president, Martha was there. Through every triumph and every setback, through years of separation and hardship, she remained his constant companion and his most trusted confidant. This was not the marriage either of them had originally bargained for, it was something far better. The story of George and Martha Washington's marriage is in many ways a story about the gap between expectations and reality. George expected a practical arrangement that would advance his social and economic position. He got that, But he also got a partner, a friend, and eventually a love that far exceeded his initial calculations. Martha expected a husband who would help manage her estate and provide stability for her children. She got that, but she also got a companion who valued her opinions, respected her abilities, and remained devoted to her for 40 years. Neither of them could have predicted, standing together at their wedding in 1759, that their practical union would become one of history's great partnerships. As night settles in and we prepare to explore the physical manifestation of this partnership, Mount Vernon, the home they built together, it is worth lingering for a moment on what the Washington marriage teaches us about love, ambition, and the unpredictable nature of human relationships. We like to think we know what we want from our partnerships, that we can calculate our way to happiness through careful consideration of compatible qualities and practical advantages. The Washingtons certainly thought they knew what they were doing when they married. George wanted wealth and status. Martha wanted stability and protection. Both got what they bargained for, but both also got something unexpected, a genuine connection that neither had sought and neither fully anticipated. Perhaps this is the most surprising aspect of the Washington marriage. It was not built on romantic love, yet it became loving. It was not founded on deep emotional connection, yet it became one of the most emotionally sustaining relationships in either of their lives. It was, in many ways, an arranged marriage that succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, including those of the two people who arranged it. In an era when love was considered a poor foundation for matrimony, George and Martha Washington accidentally proved that practical arrangements could, given time and mutual respect, blossom into something far more meaningful than either party had imagined. The letters to Sally Fairfax remain a tantalizing footnote to this story, a reminder that even the most successful marriages contain complications and counterfactuals. What if Sally had not been married when George fell in love with her? What if circumstances had allowed him to pursue his romantic passion rather than his practical ambitions? These questions are ultimately unanswerable, but they remind us that the man we remember as the father of his country was also simply a man, with desires, disappointments, and a heart that did not always follow the dictates of reason and propriety. Martha Washington, for her part, emerges from this examination as a figure of considerable strength and complexity. She was not merely the lucky beneficiary of her first husband's wealth, or the passive recipient of her second husband's ambitions. She was an active participant in building the Washington partnership, bringing her own skills, resources, and perspectives to a union that required both partners to contribute fully. She managed one of Virginia's largest households, raised 2 children through difficult circumstances, supported her husband through a Revolutionary War and 2 presidential terms, and maintained her own identity throughout decades of being overshadowed by her husband's growing legend. That she chose to burn most of their correspondence suggests she understood exactly how important their private relationship was, important enough to protect from the prying eyes of future historians, even at the cost of historical completeness. As we move forward in our exploration of George Washington's private life, we carry with us this understanding of his marriage, not as a simple romance or a cynical arrangement, but as something far more interesting and ultimately more human. The relationship that began in colonial calculation evolved into a genuine partnership that sustained Washington through the most challenging years of his life. Without Martha, the father of our country might still have won independence and shaped a nation, but he would have done so without the emotional anchor that kept him grounded, the domestic stability that allowed him to take extraordinary risks, and the loving partnership that reminded him, in his highest moments of public glory, that he was still simply George, a man who had chosen well when he chose to marry the wealthy widow of Virginia, even if his reasons for choosing were not entirely romantic. But before we leave this chapter of our story, let us delve deeper into the texture of this remarkable partnership, the daily rhythms, the unspoken understandings, and the small moments that reveal more about a marriage than any grand gesture ever could. Consider, for instance, the matter of correspondence. In an age before telephones, emails, or any form of instant communication, letters were the lifeblood of relationships separated by distance. The Washingtons, despite spending much of their married life together, were periodically separated by George's military and political duties. During these separations, they wrote to each other with a frequency and warmth that speaks volumes about their connection. George's letters to Martha during the Revolutionary War are particularly revealing. He addresses her with endearments, inquires anxiously about her health, and expresses his longing to return to her side with an urgency that seems almost desperate at times. These are not the letters of a man fulfilling a marital obligation. These are the letters of a man genuinely missing his wife. Martha's responses, tragically lost to history through her own deliberate destruction, apparently matched his tone. We know this because George's subsequent letters often reference things Martha wrote, thanking her for her expressions of affection or responding to concerns she raised. The picture that emerges, even through this incomplete correspondence, is of two people who genuinely enjoyed communicating with each other, who found comfort in the written word when physical presence was impossible, and who maintained their emotional connection across hundreds of miles and months of separation. The Revolutionary War would test the Washington marriage in ways that neither partner could have anticipated in 1759. When George was appointed commander of the Continental Army in 1775, he embarked on a journey that would keep him away from home for most of the next 8 years. For Martha, this meant managing Mount Vernon essentially alone, dealing with the uncertainties of war, and living with the constant fear that her husband might be killed in battle or captured by the British. For George, it meant leading an army while carrying the additional burden of worry about his wife and home. What Martha did in response to these circumstances reveals a great deal about both her character and the nature of their marriage. Rather than remaining safely at Mount Vernon throughout the war, she travelled to join her husband in winter quarters nearly every year. This was no small undertaking. Winter travel in the 18th century was uncomfortable at best, dangerous at worst. The journey from Virginia to wherever George's army happened to be encamped could take weeks and involved rough roads, primitive accommodations, and exposure to the elements. Yet Martha made this journey repeatedly, arriving at camp to spend the winter months with her husband before returning home in the spring when military campaigns resumed. Her presence, for George personally, having Martha with him provided emotional sustenance during the darkest months of the war. He could relax with her in ways that were impossible with subordinates or political allies. She created a domestic atmosphere within the military camp, hosting dinners, managing the household, and providing the small comforts that made headquarters feel like something approaching home. For the army more broadly, Martha's presence humanized the commander and demonstrated the kind of sacrifice that leadership required. If the general's wife was willing to endure the hardships of camp life, ordinary soldiers could hardly complain about their own conditions. Martha also served a practical function during these winter visits. She organized sewing circles among the officers' wives, producing shirts, socks, and other necessities for the soldiers. She visited sick and wounded men, bringing whatever comfort she could to those suffering from illness or injury. She managed the social complexities of headquarters, serving as hostess for the endless stream of visitors, diplomats, and politicians who sought audiences with the commander. In short, she worked, hard, sustained work that contributed materially to the war effort, while also supporting her husband in ways both visible and invisible. The intimacy that developed between George and Martha during these winter camps must have been profound. Thrown together in close quarters, with death and uncertainty lurking just beyond the firelight, they had no choice but to rely on each other completely. Whatever emotional distance might have existed in the early years of their marriage would have been impossible to maintain under such circumstances. They became, quite literally, everything to each other during these brutal winter months. And when spring came and they parted once again, George to lead his army, Martha to return to Virginia, they did so with a bond strengthened by shared hardship and mutual dependence. The war years also revealed something important about George's feelings for Martha relative to his earlier passion for Sally Fairfax. Sally and her husband had fled to England in 1773, 2 years before the war began, and would remain there for the rest of their lives. George and Sally continued to correspond occasionally, but the desperate intensity of his earlier letters was gone. He had moved beyond that romantic fantasy into something more substantial, a real marriage to a real woman who had proven herself through years of partnership and sacrifice. The comparison between what he had imagined with Sally and what he actually had with Martha must have been stark, and by all indications, reality won. This is not to suggest that George suddenly forgot Sally or stopped caring about her. Human emotions rarely resolve themselves so neatly. But the mature Washington who led the Continental Army was a different man from the lovesick young officer who had confessed his feelings to his friend's wife. He had learned through experience what actually sustained a person through difficulty, not romantic fantasy, but practical partnership. And Martha provided that partnership in abundance. The economic dimensions of the Washington marriage also deserve further examination, because they illuminate aspects of the relationship that are easy to overlook from a modern perspective. When George married Martha, he gained control of her substantial fortune, but this did not mean he simply absorbed her wealth into his own. Colonial law may have given husbands legal ownership of their wives' property, but social expectations were more nuanced. George understood that Martha's wealth came with obligations, to her children from her first marriage, to the families of her late husband, and to Martha herself. He managed the Custis estate with scrupulous attention to these obligations, maintaining separate accounts and ensuring that the inheritance was preserved for Jackie and Patsy. This careful stewardship extended to the human property that Martha brought to the marriage, the hundreds of enslaved people who worked the Custis plantations. The moral dimensions of slavery would eventually trouble Washington's conscience in ways that shaped his later thinking. But in the early years of his marriage, his primary concern was economic management. The enslaved workers represented both a labor force and a capital investment, and George managed them with the same attention to efficiency and productivity that he brought to all his agricultural endeavors. This was the reality of colonial Virginia. Prosperity was built on the backs of enslaved people, and the Washingtons were very prosperous indeed. Martha's own relationship with enslaved people was complicated by the conventions of her time and class. She had grown up in a slaveholding household, married into greater wealth that included more enslaved workers, and then married again into a situation that expanded her connection to the institution still further. Like most wealthy white women of her era, she probably did not question the fundamental morality of slavery, accepting it as a natural part of the social order. She would have interacted with enslaved people constantly. They cooked her food, cleaned her house, cared for her children, and performed virtually all manual labor in her world. The nature of these interactions ranged from relatively benign to deeply exploitative, as was typical for the institution as a whole. The evolution of George's thinking about slavery over the course of his life is a subject we will explore more fully in a later chapter, but it is worth noting here that his marriage to Martha complicated his ability to act on any moral qualms he might have developed. Many of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon belonged not to George but to the Custis estate, which meant they would eventually be inherited by Martha's children and grandchildren. George could not legally free these people even if he wanted to, because they were not his to free. This legal entanglement would shape his ultimate decisions about emancipation in ways that reveal both the constraints of his situation and the limits of his moral vision. Returning to the personal dimensions of the marriage, let us consider how the Washingtons navigated the complexities of their blended family. Martha came to the marriage with 2 young children, Jackie, who was 4, and Patsy, who was 2. George stepped into the role of stepfather with characteristic determination, approaching child-rearing as he approached everything else, as a problem to be solved through discipline, planning, and sustained effort. Unfortunately, children do not respond to military organization quite as readily as agricultural projects or business enterprises. Jackie, Martha's son, proved particularly challenging. He had been spoiled during his early childhood, first by an indulgent father and then by a grieving mother, who perhaps compensated for his father's death by relaxing all discipline. By the time George entered the picture, Jackie's character was already formed in ways that conflicted sharply with his stepfather's values. The boy was lazy, undisciplined, and apparently possessed of a cheerful unconcern about educational achievement that drove Washington to distraction. George sent Jackie to the best schools available, hired tutors, wrote letters filled with exhortations to study and improve, all to minimal effect. Jackie drifted through his education, preferring hunting and socializing to any form of serious intellectual effort. The relationship between George and Jackie would remain troubled throughout their lives, though it was never marked by open hostility. Washington loved the boy in his own reserved way, and Jackie clearly respected his stepfather even if he could not meet his expectations. When Jackie died in 1781, contracted camp fever while serving as a volunteer aide during the siege of Yorktown, Washington was genuinely grief-stricken. Whatever disappointments the boy had caused, George had spent more than 20 years as his father, and the loss was real and painful. Patsy, Martha's daughter, was in many ways an easier child to love. Sweet-tempered and affectionate, she inspired protective feelings in both her mother and stepfather. But Patsy's life was shadowed by epilepsy, a condition that was poorly understood in the 18th century and virtually untreatable. Her seizures began in childhood and grew worse as she approached adolescence, eventually becoming so frequent and severe that she could not participate in normal social life. The Washingtons tried every remedy available to them, medicines, treatments, consultations with physicians throughout the colonies, but nothing helped. In 1773, at age 17, Patsy suffered a seizure at dinner and died almost immediately. She had been healthy and happy just moments before, engaged in her usual activities when the final attack struck her down. Martha was devastated by her daughter's death. She had already lost 2 children in infancy, and now her only surviving daughter was gone as well. Contemporary accounts suggest she fell into a deep depression that lasted for months. George, too, was profoundly affected. He had come to love Patsy as his own child, had spent years worrying about her health and hoping for her recovery, and now faced the reality that all those hopes had been in vain. The loss drew George and Martha closer together in their shared grief, but it also reminded them both of how much sorrow their life together had contained alongside its triumphs. The childlessness of their own union took on new significance after Patsy's death. With Jackie as the only surviving child of the blended family, and with no biological children of their own to continue the Washington line, George and Martha faced a future without direct descendants. This was particularly painful for George, who had always envisioned himself as the founder of a dynasty, the patriarch of a family that would carry his name and values into future generations. Instead, he would have to content himself with nephews and nieces, with the children of other families, with the hope that his public legacy would substitute for the private one he had been denied. The marriages of others in their circle provided the Washingtons with a kind of extended family that partially compensated for their own lack of children. When Jackie married in 1774, against Washington's advice and much too young by his stepfather's standards, George and Martha gained a daughter-in-law and eventually grandchildren. Jackie and Eleanor Calvert Custis produced 4 children before Jackie's untimely death, and the 2 youngest, Eleanor Park Custis and George Washington Park Custis, were essentially adopted by their grandparents after their father's death and their mother's remarriage. These children brought new life to Mount Vernon and gave George and Martha something close to the parental experience they had been denied with children of their own. Yet even as they embraced this surrogate parenthood, the Washingtons must have been aware of its limitations. The grandchildren they raised were not their own, and the family they created was a patchwork of relationships rather than a direct line of descent. George poured enormous energy into guiding young George Washington Park Custis, hoping to shape the boy into the son he never had. The results were mixed. The younger George showed more affection than discipline, more charm than ambition, but the effort itself revealed something important about Washington's emotional life. He wanted desperately to be a father, and when biology denied him that opportunity, he found other ways to fulfill the role. Martha's approach to this extended family was characteristically warmer and less demanding than her husband's. She loved the grandchildren unconditionally, delighting in their company and forgiving their failures in ways that George found difficult to emulate. This difference in parenting styles, George's high expectations versus Martha's unconditional acceptance, created a balance that probably benefited the children, even as it occasionally frustrated the adults. The children knew they could count on grandmother's love regardless of their performance, but they also understood that grandfather's approval had to be earned through effort and achievement. As the years passed and the revolutionary crisis gave way to the challenges of nation-building, the Washington marriage continued to evolve. George's election as the first president of the United States in 1789 brought new responsibilities and new strains to a partnership that had already endured more than most. Martha, who had spent the war years following her husband to military camps, now found herself following him to first New York and then Philadelphia, serving as the nation's First Lady, without any precedent or guidance for what that role should entail. She did not particularly enjoy it. Martha was a private person at heart, happiest in her own home, surrounded by family and familiar faces. The public demands of the presidency were exhausting and often unpleasant. She had to host endless receptions, entertain politicians and diplomats, maintain appropriate dignity while avoiding any appearance of monarchical pretension, and do all of this while living far from the Virginia home she loved. In letters to friends and family, she described herself as a state prisoner, trapped by her husband's position, in a life she had not chosen and did not want. Yet she did it anyway, year after year, because that was what the partnership required. George needed her presence in the capital for the same reasons he had needed it at winter camps. She humanized him, created a domestic atmosphere around the presidency, and provided emotional support that no one else could offer. Martha understood this, accepted it, and performed her duties with grace even as she longed for home. This was the mature Washington marriage in action, not romantic excitement or passionate devotion, but steady, reliable partnership sustained through mutual commitment and shared sacrifice. George, for his part, was acutely aware of what he was asking Martha to endure. His letters from this period contain frequent expressions of gratitude for her presence and apologetic references to the burdens his career imposed on her. He promised, again and again, that they would eventually return to Mount Vernon and enjoy the retirement they both craved. Whether Martha fully believed these promises is uncertain. She had heard similar assurances before, only to see new responsibilities drag her husband back into public life. But she stayed, and she supported him, and she waited for the day when they could finally be just George and Martha again, without the weight of a nation on their shoulders. That day finally came in 1797, when Washington completed his second term as president and declined to seek a third. The Washingtons returned to Mount Vernon, older and tired but finally free of public obligation. They had less than 3 years together before George's death in December 1799. But those years were apparently the happiest of their marriage. They were home at last, surrounded by family and friends, free to enjoy the estate they had built together without the constant demands of military or political life. Martha's behaviour after George's death reveals perhaps more about her feelings for him than anything else in the historical record. She was devastated by his loss, describing herself as lonely and miserable without him. She moved out of their bedroom, unable to bear the memories it contained, and took up residence in a small chamber on the 3rd floor. She wore black for the remaining 2 years of her life and showed little interest in the world beyond Mount Vernon. Her burning of their correspondence was an act of love as much as privacy. She could not bear the thought of strangers reading the intimate words they had shared, of their private life becoming public property. She told visitors that she had no wish to live long without him, and she got her wish. Martha Washington died in May 1802, less than 3 years after her husband. She was buried beside him in the family vault at Mount Vernon, together at last and forever. Whatever the calculations that had brought them together in 1759, whatever the complications of Sally Fairfax and unrequited passion, they ended their story as they had lived most of it, side by side, partners in everything, bound by 40 years of shared experience into a union that transcended its practical origins. The story of George and Martha Washington's marriage offers no simple lessons about love or partnership. It began with calculation and evolved into devotion. It contained competing attachments and unfulfilled longings alongside genuine affection and mutual respect. It was tested by war, politics, family tragedy, and the ordinary challenges of any long relationship, and it emerged from each test stronger than before. It was, in short, a thoroughly human marriage, complicated, imperfect, and ultimately successful in ways that neither partner could have predicted at its beginning. What made it work? The question is impossible to answer definitively, but certain factors seem clear. George and Martha complemented each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. Martha's warmth balanced George's reserve. His ambition was grounded by her domesticity. They shared values, loyalty, duty, hard work, family, that provided a common foundation for their partnership. They respected each other's contributions to their shared life, neither diminishing the other's role or claiming superiority, and they remained committed to the marriage through difficulty and disappointment, never giving up on each other even when circumstances made giving up seem reasonable. Perhaps most importantly, they grew together over time rather than apart. The young George Washington, who married Martha Custis in 1759, was not the same man who led the Continental Army or served as president. He changed enormously over the course of his life, shaped by experience and responsibility into someone his younger self might barely have recognized. Martha changed too, from wealthy widow to commander's wife to first lady, adapting to each new role while maintaining her essential character. They made these journeys together, each transformation shared and supported by the other, until they had become so intertwined that separation was almost unthinkable. The fire crackles, the night deepens, and Mount Vernon awaits us, the physical embodiment of everything the Washingtons built together. But that is a story for our next chapter. For now, rest easy with the knowledge that one of history's great partnerships began not with lightning bolts of passion, but with sensible calculations that somehow, against all expectations, led to love. Sometimes the best stories are not the ones we expect, and sometimes the best marriages are built not on romance but on something more durable: mutual respect, shared purpose, and the willingness to grow together through whatever challenges life brings. George Washington married for money and status. He got those, but he also got something infinitely more valuable, a partner for life who made him better than he could have been alone. Martha Washington married for security and stability. She got those, but she also got something she may not have expected: a husband who genuinely valued her, relied on her, and loved her in his own reserved way until the day he died. It was not the marriage either of them imagined when they stood together in that Virginia church in 1759. It was something better. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the Revolution, before the presidency, before all the glory and sacrifice that would define their later years, There were the quiet decades of the 1760s and early 1770s, the years when George and Martha were simply a wealthy Virginia couple, building a life together, unaware that history was about to reach out and claim them for something far larger than themselves. Let us return to those early days of their marriage and examine more closely the texture of their daily existence. Morning at Mount Vernon began early, regardless of the season. George was an early riser by temperament and conviction, believing that the hours before sunrise were the most productive of the day. He would typically be awake by 4 or 5 in the morning, dressing by candlelight and beginning his daily rounds before most of the household had stirred. Martha, while perhaps not as militantly early as her husband, was no sluggard either. Running a household the size of Mount Vernon required constant attention, and she was usually about her duties well before the fashionable hour when more leisurely ladies might condescend to leave their beds. Breakfast was a modest affair by the standards of Virginia hospitality. Tea or coffee, simple bread, perhaps some cold meat from the previous evening's dinner. The elaborate breakfast spreads that would become popular in later centuries were not yet common, and the Washingtons, despite their wealth, were not given to unnecessary ostentation in their private meals. George often ate quickly, eager to get on with the business of the day. Martha probably lingered somewhat longer, reviewing the household accounts and giving instructions to the enslaved workers who managed the domestic operations. The midday meal was more substantial but still relatively simple when the Washingtons dined alone. When guests were present, which was often, the table would be laden with multiple courses, fine wines, and the best of what Mount Vernon's gardens and farms could produce. Virginia hospitality demanded generosity, and the Washingtons were generous hosts even when the effort exhausted them. Visitors often commented on the quality of the food at Mount Vernon and the warmth of their reception, unaware of how much labor went into creating the impression of effortless abundance. Dinner, served in late afternoon by 18th century custom, was the main meal of the day and the primary social occasion. Here the Washingtons entertained their endless stream of visitors, conducted their networking among Virginia's elite, and performed the rituals of hospitality that colonial society required. George, despite his reserved nature, could be an engaging host when circumstance demanded. He told stories of his military adventures, discussed agricultural innovations with fellow planters, and navigated the political gossip that flowed through Virginia society like water through a river delta. Martha managed the practical details, ensuring that food was served properly, that guests were comfortable, that conversation flowed smoothly, and that everyone went home feeling they had been treated with appropriate dignity. After dinner, as evening settled over Mount Vernon, the pace of life slowed. George might retreat to his study to work on correspondence. He was a prolific letter writer, maintaining connections across the colonies through regular communication with friends, family, and business associates. Martha would occupy herself with needlework, a skill she practiced with considerable expertise and which provided both useful products and a socially acceptable way to pass the time. If guests were present, there might be music, card games, or simply conversation around the fire. The Washingtons were not night owls. George in particular valued his sleep and typically retired relatively early, so these evening entertainments tended to conclude at a reasonable hour. This was the rhythm of their life together, repeated with variations through thousands of days across nearly 4 decades of marriage. There is something almost hypnotic about imagining it. The predictability, the comfortable routine, the steady accumulation of shared experiences that eventually becomes a life. We tend to remember historical figures in their moments of crisis and triumph, but most of their existence was made up of ordinary days like these, days when nothing particularly memorable happened except the ongoing project of living. Within this routine, George and Martha developed the habits and understandings that define long marriages. They learned each other's moods, preferences, and vulnerabilities. They developed private jokes that no one else understood and shared references that required no explanation. They knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer comfort and when to leave each other alone. These are the small intimacies that never make it into history books, but that constitute the actual substance of a relationship. The comfortable familiarity of two people who have spent so much time together that they can practically read each other's minds. Martha understood, for instance, that George needed physical activity to maintain his emotional equilibrium. When he was cooped up too long, whether by weather or circumstance, his mood would darken and his famous temper would become harder to control. She probably made sure he had opportunities to ride, to walk the grounds, to engage in the physical labor of plantation management that he found so satisfying. George, for his part, understood that Martha needed the security of routine and familiar surroundings. When circumstances forced them to relocate, to military camps during the war, to New York and Philadelphia during the presidency. He would have been aware of the strain this placed on her and would have tried to create as much stability as possible within the chaos. These mutual accommodations, invisible to outside observers, were the glue that held the marriage together through all its challenges. They required ongoing attention and adjustment as both partners changed over time, but they also provided a framework of predictability that made the unpredictable bearable. George and Martha knew they could count on each other, not just for grand gestures of loyalty and sacrifice, but for the everyday kindnesses that make shared life possible. The question of affection, whether and how the Washingtons expressed love for each other, is one that historians have puzzled over for generations. George was not demonstrative by nature. His emotional self-control was legendary, and he applied it to his personal relationships as much as to his public persona. The effusive declarations of love that some couples exchange were not his style, and we should not expect to find them in his surviving correspondence. What we find instead are quieter expressions of attachment: concern for Martha's health, eagerness to return to her company, relief when letters assured him of her well-being. These may seem inadequate by modern standards of romantic expression, but they were significant for a man who guarded his feelings as carefully as Washington did. Martha's expressions of affection are almost entirely lost to us, hidden behind the flames that consumed their private correspondence. But we can infer something about them from George's responses and from the testimony of those who knew the couple. Visitors to Mount Vernon consistently described a relationship of mutual warmth and respect. They saw George treating Martha with courtesy and consideration, saw Martha supporting her husband with patience and understanding. They witnessed a partnership that functioned smoothly and apparently happily, without the tensions and resentments that plagued many marriages of the era. This is not definitive proof of love, but it is suggestive of something more than mere convenience. The physical dimension of the Washingtons' relationship is another subject that history has largely obscured. 18th century Americans did not discuss such matters publicly, and the private sources that might have enlightened us are gone. We know they shared a bedroom, as was customary for married couples of their class. We know they had no children together, which may or may not indicate anything about the physical nature of their union. Beyond that, we can only speculate. And speculation about the intimate lives of historical figures is a game that tells us more about our own obsessions than about the people we claim to be studying. What we can say with confidence is that the Washington marriage was characterized by physical proximity and shared space. They ate together, slept together, entertained together, traveled together when circumstances permitted. They spent far more time in each other's company than many modern couples manage, despite the demands of George's various careers. This constant togetherness either strengthened their bond or would have destroyed it. There was no middle ground. The fact that their marriage not only survived but apparently flourished under such conditions suggests a fundamental compatibility that went beyond mere tolerance. George Washington was not a particularly devout man by the standards of his era. He attended church regularly, as social convention required, and he sprinkled his public statements with references to providence and divine guidance. But he rarely spoke of personal faith, never took communion according to some accounts, and seems to have viewed religion more as a social institution than a source of spiritual sustenance. Martha was apparently more conventionally religious, though the evidence for her beliefs is also limited. What role, if any, shared faith played in binding them together is simply unknown. We do know that they shared certain values that might be called spiritual in a broad sense: commitment to duty, belief in the importance of moral character, respect for the institutions that structured society. These shared values provided common ground that probably mattered more to their relationship than any specific religious doctrine. They agreed on what mattered, on how life should be lived, on what kind of people they wanted to be. This agreement, whether rooted in religious faith or secular conviction, gave them a foundation for partnership that proved remarkably durable. As we conclude this exploration of the Washington marriage, let us step back and consider what it reveals about the man we're trying to understand. George Washington, we have seen, was capable of passionate romantic attachment. His letters to Sally Fairfax proved that beyond doubt. But he was also capable of making practical decisions that prioritized long-term benefit over immediate gratification. He chose to marry Martha not because he loved her most, but because she was the wisest choice available to him. And then, this is the crucial part, he committed himself fully to the choice he had made. This pattern of deliberate choice followed by total commitment would characterize Washington's entire career. He did not seek command of the Continental Army, but once he accepted it, he gave everything he had to the cause. He did not want to be president, But once he took the office, he devoted himself completely to establishing it on a firm foundation. He was a man who understood that commitment once made had to be absolute, regardless of whatever doubts or regrets might linger in the background. The marriage to Martha was his first and perhaps most important exercise of this principle. Having chosen her for practical reasons, he chose to make the marriage work, to invest in it emotionally as well as economically, to build something real from what might have remained a mere arrangement. The love that developed between them was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate efforts sustained over decades. And that deliberate love, chosen rather than merely felt, may have been stronger in the end than any passion could have been. Martha, for her part, brought her own form of commitment to the partnership. She had already buried one husband and faced the challenges of widowhood with young children. She knew what it meant to be alone, and she had no intention of being alone again. When she married George, she committed herself to building a new life with him, supporting his ambitions and creating a home that would sustain them both through whatever challenges lay ahead. She could not have known in 1759 that those challenges would include a revolutionary war and the founding of a nation, but when they came, she met them with the same steady determination that characterized everything she did. Together, they created something that was greater than either of them could have achieved alone. George Washington, without Martha, might still have been successful, but he would have been lonelier, less grounded, more vulnerable to the isolation that his reserved nature tended to create around him. Martha Washington, without George, would probably have remarried someone else and lived a comfortable life as a Virginia plantation wife. But she would have missed the adventure, the significance, the extraordinary experience of standing at her husband's side as he helped birth a nation. They needed each other, and they were fortunate enough to find each other at a moment when both were ready for exactly what the other could provide. The fire burns low now, and the night grows late. We have travelled through the complicated terrain of George and Martha Washington's marriage, from its calculated beginnings through its evolution into genuine partnership. We have met Sally Fairfax, the woman who might have been but never was. We have seen the practical considerations that brought George and Martha together, and the deeper bonds that kept them together through 40 years of shared life. We have witnessed the small intimacies and large sacrifices that made their union one of history's great partnerships. But Mount Vernon still awaits us, the place where all of this unfolded, the stage on which the Washington marriage played out its long drama, the house that George transformed from a modest farmstead into one of Virginia's finest estates, the land he loved with a passion that sometimes rivaled his love for anything human, the home that represented everything he wanted to be and everything he worked to achieve. That is where our story continues, in the next chapter of this journey through George Washington's private life. For now, let sleep begin to settle in. Close your eyes if they are growing heavy, and let the images of colonial Virginia drift through your mind. The candlelit rooms of Mount Vernon, the figure of Washington riding his fields at dawn, the steady presence of Martha managing the household she had made her own. They are waiting for us there, in that place that meant more to them than any other, ready to reveal new dimensions of their remarkable story. Rest now. Mount Vernon will be there when you wake. And as you drift towards sleep, consider this final thought about the marriage we have just explored. George Washington is remembered for commanding armies and presiding over nations, for moments of crisis where the fate of millions hung on his decisions. But he would probably tell you, if you could ask him, that his greatest achievement was more personal, finding in Martha a companion who made all those public accomplishments possible. Behind every marble statue and every heroic portrait was this simple fact. He was a married man who loved his wife, who relied on her strength, and who built his extraordinary life on the foundation of their partnership. It endured not through passion but through commitment. It succeeded not because fate had decreed it, but because two imperfect people chose day after day to make it work. And in the end, it became a love story after all, just not the kind we usually expect. Not Romeo and Juliet, burning bright and ending in tragedy. Something quieter, steadier, and ultimately more lasting. Something that survived 40 years, a revolution, a presidency, and all the ordinary challenges that any marriage must face. Something real. George Washington, who began his adult life longing for a woman he could never have, ended it beside a woman who had become everything to him. Martha Washington, who remarried for practical reasons, discovered that practicality and love were not mutually exclusive after all. Together, they proved that the best marriages are not necessarily the ones that begin with fireworks, but the ones that build heat slowly and steadily until they become a fire that nothing can extinguish. The night embraces Mount Vernon now as it has for centuries. The house is quiet, the candles extinguished, the ghosts of George and Martha long since departed to wherever history's actors go when their parts are done. But something of them remains, in the walls they built, in the land they tended, in the story of two people who found in each other something neither had expected to find. It is a good story, a true story, and a story that reminds us that even the greatest figures in history were, beneath all their accomplishments, simply human beings trying to make their way through life with whatever love and companionship they could find. The morning mist rises slowly from the Potomac, curling around the trees like something out of a particularly atmospheric painting. The year is 1760, and George Washington stands on the east lawn of Mount Vernon, surveying his domain with the intensity of a man who has finally gotten what he wanted and now has to figure out what to do with it. This was not just a house to him. This was not merely an estate or an investment or a place to hang his hat between military campaigns. Mount Vernon was George Washington's soul made visible, the physical manifestation of everything he believed about himself and everything he aspired to become. To understand George Washington the private man, you must first understand his relationship with this particular patch of Virginia soil. And that relationship was quite frankly obsessive. Other men of his era collected art or books or political power. Washington collected acreage. He expanded Mount Vernon from the modest farmhouse he had inherited into one of the largest and most impressive estates in Virginia, and he did so with a single-minded determination that occasionally bordered on the compulsive. When he could not be at Mount Vernon in person, which was often given his military and political careers, he wrote letters about it. Endless letters. Letters about crops and livestock and buildings and fences and drainage and soil composition and the precise angle at which his garden paths should be laid. Letters that would make a modern real estate developer weep with recognition. The estate that Washington transformed so dramatically had not always been called Mount Vernon. It was originally known as Little Hunting Creek Plantation, which admittedly lacks a certain grandeur. Washington's older half-brother Lawrence had renamed it in honor of Admiral Edward Vernon, under whom Lawrence had served during the War of Jenkins' Ear. Yes, there was actually a war called the War of Jenkins' Ear. No, we do not have time to explain it. The important thing is that Lawrence got the estate, renamed it something more dignified, and then conveniently died without surviving children, eventually leaving the property to George. When Washington first took possession of Mount Vernon in 1754, it was a relatively modest operation, about 2,000 acres with a simple 1.5-story house. By the time he died in 1799, he had expanded it to nearly 8,000 acres, divided into 5 separate farms, and had transformed the house into the stately mansion that tourists still visit today. This transformation did not happen by accident. It happened because George Washington cared about Mount Vernon with an intensity that he reserved for very few things in his life, and he was willing to pour virtually unlimited resources into making it exactly what he wanted it to be. The house itself underwent multiple expansions and renovations during Washington's lifetime, each one carefully planned and obsessively supervised. He added a full second story, then extended the building on both ends, then added the distinctive cupola that still crowns the structure, then constructed the famous piazza, that long-covered porch overlooking the Potomac that has become one of the most recognizable architectural features in American history. Every detail mattered to him. He specified the exact dimensions of rooms, the placement of windows, the style of moldings, the color of paint. His letters to the overseers managing construction during his absences read like the correspondence of an anxious first-time homeowner, except this particular homeowner was simultaneously commanding an army or running a country. The grounds received equally obsessive attention. Washington designed elaborate gardens, planted groves of trees, laid out serpentine paths in the fashionable English style, and created vistas that directed the eye toward the river and the Maryland shore beyond. He imported plants from around the world, experimented with exotic species, and maintained detailed records of what thrived and what failed. The landscape of Mount Vernon was not merely decorative, it was a statement about who George Washington was and what he valued. He wanted visitors to approach the house through carefully curated scenery that would impress them with his taste, his wealth, and his status as a Virginia gentleman of the first rank. This obsession with Mount Vernon's appearance sometimes veered into territory that would be familiar to anyone who has watched home improvement shows spiral out of control. Washington was forever tinkering, forever improving, forever dissatisfied with some aspect of the estate that needed correction. No sooner would one project be completed than another would begin. The workers at Mount Vernon must have greeted each new letter from their master with a mixture of anticipation and dread. wondering what fresh demands the latest missive would contain. Build a new greenhouse. Relocate the kitchen garden. Dig a ha-ha, a sunken fence that kept livestock off the lawn without interrupting the view. The ha-ha, incidentally, was a real thing that real 18th century people built and named, presumably because they found the concept amusing. But beneath all this aesthetic obsession lay something deeper and more fundamental. Washington's genuine passion for the land itself and for the work of farming it. He was not merely a gentleman playing at agriculture while servants did the actual labour. He was a serious, dedicated farmer who threw himself into the science and practice of cultivation with the same intensity he brought to military strategy. This was not common among Virginia planters of his era. Most wealthy landowners viewed their estates primarily as sources of income and social status, leaving the details of agriculture to overseers, while they occupied themselves with politics, hunting, and the elaborate social rituals of colonial life. Washington participated in all those activities certainly, but his heart was in the fields. The tobacco economy of colonial Virginia was, by the mid-18th century, slowly choking on its own success. Tobacco was fantastically profitable when grown on virgin soil, but it exhausted the land with ruthless efficiency. Plant tobacco on the same field for a few years and the yields would plummet. The conventional solution was simply to clear more forest, plant tobacco until the new land was also exhausted, and then repeat the process. This worked well enough when land was essentially unlimited, but by Washington's time, the best Virginia soil had been under cultivation for generations, and the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Washington recognized this problem earlier than most of his contemporaries and set about solving it with characteristic determination. His solution was radical for its time. He would stop growing tobacco altogether and transition Mount Vernon to a diversified agricultural operation focused on wheat, corn, and other crops that were less destructive to the soil. This decision was not merely economic, though the economics certainly favored the change. It was philosophical. Washington believed in sustainable agriculture long before that term was invented, and he was willing to sacrifice short-term profits for long-term viability. The transition away from tobacco was neither quick nor easy. Washington began the process in the 1760s, gradually reducing his tobacco acreage while expanding production of wheat and other grains. He built a grist mill to process his wheat into flour, which could be sold for higher prices than raw grain. He established a fishery on the Potomac, harvesting and salting the abundant herring and shad that migrated up the river each spring. He experimented with flax, hemp, and various other crops that might contribute to a more balanced and sustainable operation. Not all of these experiments succeeded. Farming rarely offers guaranteed outcomes, but Washington learned from his failures and continued to adapt. The crop rotation systems that Washington developed at Mount Vernon were remarkably sophisticated for their era. He divided his farms into numbered fields and rotated different crops through each field according to carefully planned schedules. A field might grow wheat one year, then corn, then oats mixed with clover, then lie fallow to recover its fertility before starting the cycle again. This rotation prevented the soil exhaustion that tobacco caused and actually improved fertility over time as nitrogen-fixing plants like clover enriched the ground. Washington kept meticulous records of these rotations, tracking yields from each field and adjusting his plans based on the results. Hemp cultivation was one of Washington's more interesting agricultural ventures, though probably not for the reasons that modern readers might imagine. In the 18th century, hemp was a valuable industrial crop used primarily to produce rope and canvas, essential materials for the shipping industry that moved colonial goods to market. Virginia actually required landowners to grow hemp as a matter of law for some years, though this requirement was inconsistently enforced. Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon throughout his farming career, though he never achieved the success with it that he enjoyed with wheat and other crops. His letters contain references to hemp cultivation that read as prosaic agricultural commentary, not the confessions of an 18th century recreational user. Sorry to disappoint anyone hoping for evidence that the father of his country enjoyed getting high on his own supply. The innovations at Mount Vernon extended beyond crop selection to include new farming techniques and equipment. Washington was an eager adopter of the latest agricultural technology, importing plows, harrows, and other implements from England when American manufacturers could not match European quality. He corresponded with agricultural reformers on both sides of the Atlantic, exchanging ideas about soil improvement, animal husbandry, and farm management. He subscribed to agricultural journals and read extensively about farming practices in other countries, always looking for techniques he might adapt to Virginia conditions. One of his more ambitious projects was an attempt to develop a new type of plough better suited to American conditions. Washington believed that European ploughs were poorly designed for the heavier soils common in Virginia, and he spent considerable time and energy working with local craftsmen to create an improved version. The results were mixed. Plough design, it turns out, is more complicated than it might appear, but the effort itself reveals something important about Washington's character. He was not content merely to follow established practices. He wanted to understand why things worked the way they did, and whether they might be improved. Livestock management received similar attention. Washington experimented with different breeds of horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs, always seeking animals that would thrive in Virginia's climate while producing superior meat, wool, or draft power. He imported animals from Spain, France, and England, hoping to improve his herds through selective breeding. His correspondence includes lengthy discussions of animal bloodlines that read like the notes of a modern genetics researcher, except written in elegant 18th century prose and concerned with sheep rather than DNA sequences. The mules of Mount Vernon deserve particular mention, because Washington was among the first American farmers to recognize the value of these hybrid animals. Mules, the offspring of male donkeys and female horses, combine the strength of horses with the endurance and sure-footedness of donkeys, making them ideal work animals for agricultural settings. Washington was so enthusiastic about mules that he sought to import quality breeding stock from Spain, where the finest donkeys were found. This proved surprisingly difficult, as Spain had laws restricting the export of their superior donkeys, apparently viewing them as a strategic agricultural resource. Washington eventually obtained suitable animals through diplomatic channels, receiving a gift of breeding stock from the King of Spain himself. The father of his country, it seems, was willing to leverage his international connections in pursuit of better farm animals. The fishery that Washington established on the Potomac represented another form of agricultural diversification. Each spring, enormous runs of herring and shad migrated up the river to spawn, and Washington organized operations to harvest and preserve these fish in commercial quantities. The work was labor-intensive. Hundreds of thousands of fish had to be caught, cleaned, salted, and packed in barrels during a relatively short season. But the results were valuable. Washington's fishery became one of the more profitable operations at Mount Vernon, contributing significantly to the estate's overall economy. The experimental nature of Washington's farming extended even to his orcharding, which he approached with the same systematic curiosity he brought to field crops. He planted hundreds of fruit trees at Mount Vernon, including apples, pears, cherries, and peaches. He experimented with grafting techniques, trying to combine the best qualities of different varieties into improved specimens. He kept records of which trees produced well and which disappointed, gradually refining his orchard toward optimal production. The results were a source of considerable personal pride. Washington loved showing visitors his fruit trees and serving them products from the Mount Vernon orchards. None of this would have been possible without an enormous labor force, and here we must acknowledge the dark foundation upon which Mount Vernon's success was built. The hundreds of enslaved people who worked Washington's farms did the actual physical labor of plowing, planting, harvesting, and processing the crops that Washington so carefully planned. His agricultural innovations depended entirely on their unfree labor. When we admire his crop rotation systems or his diversification strategies, we must remember that these achievements were purchased at the cost of human bondage. Washington was an innovative farmer, yes, but he was also a slaveholder who profited directly from the exploitation of other human beings. The contradiction between Washington's ideals and his practices regarding slavery would trouble him increasingly as he aged. But during the productive years of the 1760s and early 1770s, he appears to have accepted the institution without much moral anguish. This was typical of Virginia planters of his generation. Slavery was so deeply embedded in the colonial economy and society that most white Virginians simply could not imagine functioning without it. Washington was no exception, at least not yet. The evolution of his thinking about slavery is a subject we will explore more fully later. But for now, we must acknowledge that his agricultural achievements rested on a foundation of profound injustice. If you had met George Washington at a dinner party in 1765, you would probably have found him impressive but somewhat distant. Tall, remarkably tall for his era, at 6 feet 2 inches when the average man stood around 5'7", he would have towered over most of the other guests. His physical presence was commanding, even intimidating. But his manner was reserved, his conversation measured, his emotions carefully controlled behind a mask of dignified calm. This was the public Washington, the carefully constructed persona that would serve him so well in his later career as commander and president. But the private Washington was rather different. Behind that famous reserve lurked a temper that those who knew him well learned to respect and sometimes to fear. Washington's rage, when it surfaced, was formidable. His face would flush, his voice would rise, and the usually controlled gentleman would transform briefly into something approaching a force of nature. These outbursts were rare. Washington worked hard to prevent them, but when they occurred, they left lasting impressions on everyone who witnessed them. The self-control that Washington displayed in public was not natural to him. It was learned, cultivated, developed through years of deliberate effort. As a young man, he had been considerably more volatile, prone to emotional displays that he would later come to regret. The famous rules of civility that he copied out as a teenager, a list of behavioral guidelines covering everything from proper table manners to how to walk through a doorway, represented an early attempt to discipline his natural impulses into socially acceptable forms. These rules were not original to Washington. They were a standard educational text of the era, translated from French Jesuit teachings. But the fact that young George took the time to copy them out by hand suggests that he recognized his need for guidance in the art of self-presentation. The cultivation of self-control became a lifelong project for Washington, one that he pursued with the same determination he brought to farming or military strategy. He understood, perhaps intuitively at first and more consciously as he matured, that success in colonial Virginia required mastering the appearance of gentility. A gentleman did not lose his temper. A gentleman did not display vulgar emotions. A gentleman maintained his composure under all circumstances, presenting to the world a face of calm dignity, regardless of what storms might be raging beneath the surface. This does not mean that Washington was emotionless. Far from it. The evidence suggests he felt things deeply: love, anger, disappointment, pride, grief. But he had learned to channel these feelings rather than display them. The same intensity that might have produced emotional outbursts in a less disciplined person was redirected into his work, his ambitions, his relationships. Washington did not suppress his passions, he harnessed them. The relationship between Washington's emotional nature and his physical appearance was noted by contemporaries who knew him well. When he was pleased or excited, a warmth would come into his features that observers found genuinely charming. His rare laughs were described as full and hearty, transforming his usually serious face into something more approachable. But when he was angry, really angry, the transformation was equally dramatic. His face would darken, his eyes would flash, and the temperature in the room would seem to drop several degrees as everyone present realized they were witnessing something they would prefer not to see twice. The military provided Washington with an arena for disciplining his emotions that civilian life could not match. The demands of command required constant self-control. A leader who lost his temper at every setback would quickly lose the confidence of his men. Washington learned during the French and Indian War that his natural volatility was a liability in leadership, and he worked systematically to overcome it. The process was not always successful. He could still flare up when provoked, particularly when he felt his honor or competence was being questioned. But he developed an ability to recover quickly from these outbursts, to regain his composure and proceed as if nothing had happened. The famous incident at Kip's Bay during the Revolutionary War illustrates both Washington's capacity for rage and his ultimate ability to control it. When American troops broke and fled before a British attack, Washington rode into the chaos, literally trying to rally the men by his presence. When they continued to flee, he lost his temper completely, reportedly striking fleeing soldiers with the flat of his sword and shouting in fury at their cowardice. For a few minutes, the careful control he had cultivated over decades simply shattered, and the raw Washington emerged, passionate, furious, and potentially dangerous. But he recovered. The moment passed, and the commander returned to his duties with renewed determination. This pattern of control, occasional eruption, and swift recovery characterized Washington's emotional life throughout his career. He was not a cold man, despite the marble-faced image that posterity has inherited. He was a man of strong feelings who had learned, through decades of practice, to present a calm exterior to the world while managing the turbulence within. This was exhausting work, and it helps explain why Washington so craved the retirement at Mount Vernon that circumstances kept denying him. At home, with Martha among familiar surroundings and trusted servants, he could relax the constant vigilance that public life required. The lighter side of Washington's emotional nature, his capacity for warmth, humor, and genuine enjoyment, deserves equal attention. though it is less frequently discussed. The same man who could terrify subordinates with his anger could also charm guests at dinner with his warmth and hospitality. He loved dancing, attending balls and assemblies with evident pleasure well into his 50s. He enjoyed theatre, attending performances whenever his duties brought him to cities where theatre was available. He played cards, though not for high stakes, and he took evident pleasure in good food and wine without descending into the excess that characterized some of his contemporaries. His sense of humour, though not flamboyant, was genuine and appreciated by those who knew him well. Washington's jokes tended toward the dry and understated. He was not a man for broad comedy or pratfalls, but he could appreciate absurdity and occasionally produced witty observations that caught even close associates by surprise. His letters sometimes contain flashes of humour that reveal a lighter touch than his formal reputation would suggest. He made jokes about his own advancing age, his struggles with his teeth, his failures in agriculture. These were not the utterances of a humourless automaton, but of a man who could laugh at himself when circumstances warranted. The relationship between Washington's public persona and his private self was something that those closest to him understood and accommodated. Martha knew which moods required gentle handling and which could be safely ignored. His military aides learned to read the subtle signs that indicated their commander's emotional state. Close friends understood that the reserved dignity Washington displayed at formal occasions was a performance, not the complete person. They had seen him relax into warmth and even playfulness when circumstances permitted, and they valued those glimpses of the man behind the monument. The physical labour that Washington loved, riding his fields, supervising work, engaging directly with the land, served as an emotional release valve that his psychological health required. A modern observer might recognise this pattern, the man of intense emotions who finds peace in physical activity, whose mind settles when his body is engaged in purposeful work. Washington at Mount Vernon, riding out at dawn to inspect his farms, was performing a kind of therapy that helped maintain the equilibrium his temperament constantly threatened to upset. As we conclude this exploration of Washington's inner life, we are left with a picture far more complex than the marble statue that posterity has erected. Here was a man of powerful emotions who learned to control them, a man of genuine warmth who presented a cool exterior to the world, a man who could terrify with his anger and charm with his hospitality in the same afternoon. He was not the emotionless icon of American mythology, but neither was he the passionate romantic of some revisionist accounts. He was something more interesting and more human, a man who understood his own nature, recognized its dangers, and worked deliberately to shape it into something that could serve his ambitions and his country. The fire burns lower now and the hour grows late. We have walked the fields of Mount Vernon with Washington, watched him experiment with crops and struggle with his temper, glimpsed the private man behind the public facade. But there is more to discover. His complicated relationship with the enslaved people who made his prosperity possible, his role as stepfather to Martha's children, the unexpected passions that revealed themselves in moments of leisure. These stories await us in the chapters ahead. For now, let the image of Washington at Mount Vernon settle into your mind, not the marble figure, but the living man. The farmer who rose before dawn and knew the name of every worker on his estate. The husband who found in his marriage something he had not expected to find. The planner who could not resist improving, always improving, the land and buildings that represented his vision of himself. The man of hidden depths who showed the world a calm surface while passion stirred beneath. Sleep approaches now, carried on the soft sounds of the Virginia night. The Potomac flows past Mount Vernon as it has for millennia, indifferent to the ambitions and sorrows of the humans who have lived upon its banks. George Washington is long gone, but the place he loved remains, waiting for visitors who want to understand the man who helped create a nation. And understanding him requires knowing not just what he accomplished, but who he was. Complicated, driven, passionate beneath his reserve, and thoroughly, unmistakably human. Rest now. There is more of his story to tell, but it will keep until we meet again. But before we let sleep fully claim us, let us linger a moment longer with the question of what Mount Vernon meant to Washington, not just as a property or a project, but as an emotional anchor in a life that would eventually become remarkably unmoored from ordinary experience. For most of his adult life, Washington was pulled away from the place he loved by duties he had not sought but could not refuse. The French and Indian War took him away. The Revolutionary War took him away for 8 years. The Constitutional Convention took him away. The presidency took him away for another 8 years. Again and again he was called to serve, and again he answered the call while longing for home. His letters from these periods of absence are filled with references to Mount Vernon, plans for improvements, inquiries about crops, expressions of yearning to return. The estate was always there in his mind, a fixed point of reference in a world that kept demanding he be somewhere else. This longing for home was not merely sentimental. It was connected to something fundamental about Washington's sense of himself. He was at his core a farmer. Not a soldier, though he proved to be a capable one. Not a politician, though he navigated politics with surprising skill. A farmer, a man who found meaning in the cycle of planting and harvest, who took genuine pleasure in watching things grow, who felt most fully himself when walking his fields at dawn, with dirt under his fingernails and the smell of turned earth in his nostrils. Everything else, the military glory, the political power, the historical fame, was in some sense a distraction from what he really wanted to be doing. The irony was not lost on him. Here was a man who could have been perfectly content as a wealthy Virginia planter, minding his own business and improving his estate in peaceful obscurity. Circumstances conspired to make him instead the most famous man in America, the indispensable leader whose presence was required at every crucial moment of national founding. He did his duty. Washington always did his duty, but he never stopped wanting to go home. The last years of his life, finally retired at Mount Vernon after the presidency, were probably the happiest he had known since those early years of his marriage. He was where he belonged at last. The improvements Washington made to Mount Vernon were not just aesthetic indulgences or status symbols. They were expressions of love. When he designed the piazza overlooking the Potomac, he was creating a space where he could sit in the evenings with Martha, watching the sun set over the river and enjoying the view he had worked so hard to perfect. When he laid out the serpentine paths through the grounds, he was imagining walking those paths with family and friends, sharing the beauty he had created with the people he cared about. When he planted trees that would not reach maturity for decades, he was making an investment in a future he might not live to see, trusting that Mount Vernon would endure long after he was gone. This long-term thinking characterized everything Washington did at the estate. He was not interested in quick profits or immediate gratification. He wanted to build something lasting, a property that would support his family for generations, a model of what enlightened agriculture could achieve, a monument to his vision of what Virginia could become. The fact that he had no biological children to inherit this legacy added a poignant note to his efforts. He was building for the future anyway, whether or not that future would include his own descendants. The emotional attachment to Mount Vernon also shaped Washington's political philosophy in ways that historians have sometimes overlooked. His vision of America was essentially agrarian, a nation of independent farmers working their own land, beholden to no one, self-sufficient and virtuous. This vision was rooted in his own experience at Mount Vernon, in the satisfaction he found in agricultural work, in his belief that the farmer's life was the best life a free man could live. When he warned against the dangers of cities, of commercial speculation, of excessive dependence on foreign trade, he was speaking from the perspective of a man who had found his own fulfillment in the soil of Virginia. The contrast between this agrarian ideal and the reality of plantation slavery was one of many contradictions that Washington never fully resolved. He believed in the virtue of agricultural labour, but the labour at Mount Vernon was performed primarily by enslaved people who had no choice in the matter. He valued independence and self-sufficiency, but his own prosperity depended on the systematic denial of these qualities to hundreds of human beings. He spoke of liberty and natural rights while owning other people as property. These contradictions were embedded in the very landscape he loved. The beautiful fields and gardens of Mount Vernon were maintained by unfree labour, and no amount of philosophical reflection could change that fact. Washington's response to these contradictions evolved over time, from unthinking acceptance in his youth to increasing discomfort in his later years. But the evolution was slow, and it never resulted in the kind of decisive action, freeing his slaves during his lifetime, for instance, that would have demonstrated a complete rejection of the system he had profited from. Instead, he freed his slaves in his will, a gesture that absolved his conscience without requiring him to face the practical consequences of liberation during his own lifetime. This was not cowardice exactly, but it was not courage either. It was the response of a man caught between his principles and his interests, unable to fully sacrifice one for the other. The agricultural experiments we discussed earlier take on additional complexity when viewed through this lens. Washington's innovations, the crop rotation, the diversification, the sustainable practices, were designed partly to reduce his dependence on the labour-intensive tobacco cultivation that required large numbers of enslaved workers. He hoped, perhaps, that a more efficient agriculture would eventually make slavery unnecessary, allowing him to resolve his moral dilemma through economic evolution rather than dramatic action. This hope was probably sincere, but it was also convenient, allowing him to postpone difficult decisions while telling himself that progress was being made. The hidden emotions that we explored in the previous section, Washington's struggle to control his temper, his rare moments of genuine laughter, his capacity for warmth beneath the reserve, were all expressed most freely at Mount Vernon. This was the place where he could relax, where the constant performance of public life could be set aside, where he could simply be George rather than General Washington or President Washington. The estate was not just a property, it was a refuge, a sanctuary, a place where his complicated inner life could find expression without the constant scrutiny that his public roles imposed. Martha understood this, which is one reason she supported the endless improvements and expansions even when they must have seemed excessive. She knew that Washington needed Mount Vernon in ways that went beyond mere ownership. The estate was his therapy, his creative outlet, his connection to a simpler identity beneath the layers of fame and responsibility. When she followed him to military camps during the war, she was leaving behind not just comfort but the place where her husband was most fully himself. That sacrifice, repeated year after year, speaks to the depth of her commitment to their partnership. The servants and enslaved workers at Mount Vernon saw a side of Washington that most Americans never encountered. They knew his daily routines, his moods, his preferences. They witnessed his tender moments with Martha and his frustrated outbursts when things went wrong. They heard him laugh and saw him cry, for Washington did cry despite his reputation for stoic reserve, particularly after the deaths of family members and close friends. These witnesses to his private life left few records of their observations for obvious reasons, but the glimpses we do have suggest a man far more human than the marble icon of national mythology. The question of what Mount Vernon reveals about Washington's character is ultimately a question about the relationship between place and identity. We're all shaped by the environments we inhabit, but Washington took this relationship to an extreme. He did not merely live at Mount Vernon, he created it, shaped it, poured himself into it until the boundary between the man and the place became difficult to discern. The estate was an extension of his personality, ambitious, orderly, constantly striving for improvement, impressive in its scope while concealing significant contradictions beneath the polished surface. When Washington died in December 1799, he was buried at Mount Vernon according to his wishes. He had specified that he wanted to rest on the estate he had loved so much, and his family honoured that request. Martha joined him there less than 3 years later, and today they lie together in a tomb on the grounds, still at home after more than 2 centuries. The estate itself passed through various hands before eventually becoming a museum and historic site, preserved for future generations to visit and contemplate. Visitors to Mount Vernon today can walk the same grounds that Washington walked, stand on the same piazza where he watched the sunset, and try to imagine the man who made this place what it was. The house looks much as it did in his lifetime, carefully restored to reflect his final years. The gardens bloom according to his original plans. The views he designed are still there to admire, but the man himself is gone, and with him went the animating spirit that made Mount Vernon more than just a beautiful property. What remains is a monument, fitting perhaps for a man who spent so much of his life being turned into one, even as the private person behind the monument longed for nothing more than to tend his fields in peace. The night has grown deep now, and Mount Vernon sleeps beneath the Virginia stars as it has for centuries. We have explored its grounds, examined its meaning, and tried to understand why this particular place mattered so much to this particular man. The answers are not simple. Nothing about George Washington is simple. But they point towards something important about the human need for home, for belonging, for a place where we can be our truest selves. Washington found that place at Mount Vernon. The world kept calling him away, kept demanding that he sacrifice his private happiness for public duty, and he always answered the call. But he never stopped longing for home, never stopped planning improvements he might never see completed, never stopped believing that his real life was waiting for him on those Virginia acres whenever the world would finally let him return. In the end, the world did let him return. It was not enough time, it never is, but it was something. And when death came for him, it found him at home, in the place he loved, surrounded by the people and things that had given his life meaning beyond the public achievements. That is what Mount Vernon meant to George Washington. Not just a house or an estate or an investment. A home. The truest home he ever knew. And now, as sleep approaches, perhaps we can understand a little better why he cared so much about every tree planted, every crop rotated, every building improved. He was not just managing property. He was creating a place where he belonged, a physical manifestation of who he was and who he wanted to be. Sweet dreams now. The journey continues, but for tonight we rest, just as Washington rested when he finally came home. And as you drift off, consider one final image. George Washington in his 60s, finally done with the presidency, finally free of public obligation, standing on the east lawn of Mount Vernon as the first light of dawn breaks over the Potomac. He has been awake for an hour already, unable to sleep late even in retirement, and he is dressed for riding because there are fields to inspect, crops to evaluate, improvements to plan. The morning mist rises around him, and for this one quiet moment, before the day's demands begin, he is simply a man looking at the land he loves. He knows his time is limited. He is old for his era, 67 when death finally comes, and he has already endured enough illnesses to kill several ordinary men. But this morning, in this moment, he is not thinking about mortality. He's thinking about whether the new wheat variety he planted in the North Field is thriving, whether the dam on Dogue Run needs repairs, whether the greenhouse plants survived the recent cold snap. These are the concerns of a farmer, not a hero, and they bring him a peace that public acclaim never could. This is the Washington we have tried to find in these chapters. Not the monument, but the man. The passionate planter who found his deepest satisfaction in dirt and seed. The emotional man who learned to control his temper through decades of practice. The husband who built a life with Martha that transcended its practical origins. The complicated figure who loved liberty while owning slaves, who wanted nothing more than domestic peace while accepting every call to public service. He was contradictory, as all humans are. He was ambitious and humble, passionate and controlled, public and private in ways that resisted easy categorization. He created at Mount Vernon a physical manifestation of his aspirations, and he returned to it whenever the world allowed, seeking the peace that only home could provide. The estate still stands more than 2 centuries after his death. The house he expanded and improved looks out over the Potomac as it always has. The gardens he designed still bloom in their seasons. And somewhere in the Virginia soil the roots of trees he planted continue to grow, reaching down into earth that he once walked, touched, and loved with an intensity that history has not forgotten. Now we arrive at the part of George Washington's story that makes everyone uncomfortable, and rightly so. The man who declared that all men are created equal. Well, technically that was Jefferson, but Washington certainly endorsed the sentiment, owned other human beings as property. Not a few, not briefly. Hundreds of people for his entire adult life. This is the contradiction at the heart of the American founding, and nowhere is it more starkly visible than in the life of the father of his country. Let us be clear from the outset. There is no way to make this comfortable. We cannot explain away Washington's slaveholding as merely a product of his time, though it certainly was that. We cannot excuse it by pointing to his eventual emancipation of his slaves in his will, though that gesture was significant. We cannot pretend that his conflicted feelings somehow absolved him of responsibility for the system he participated in and profited from. What we can do is try to understand how a man of genuine intelligence and moral seriousness could have lived with this contradiction, and what his relationship with the enslaved people at Mount Vernon actually looked like. When Washington married Martha in 1759, the number of enslaved people under his control roughly tripled. Martha's first husband had been one of Virginia's wealthiest planters, and his estate included several hundred enslaved workers who now came under George's management. Combined with the enslaved people he already owned outright, Washington found himself overseeing a labor force of more than 300 human beings, men, women, and children, whose lives were entirely subject to his authority. This was not a responsibility he had sought exactly, but it was one he accepted without apparent moral qualms, at least in those early years. The economic reality of Mount Vernon was simple. Without enslaved labor, the estate could not function. The fields would not be ploughed, the crops would not be harvested, the livestock would not be tended, the house would not be cleaned, the meals would not be cooked. Everything that made Mount Vernon prosperous and comfortable depended on the unfree labor of people who received no wages, had no rights, and could be bought or sold at their owner's pleasure. Washington understood this reality with the clarity of a businessman examining his balance sheet. The enslaved workers were assets, and like any assets, they needed to be managed efficiently. This managerial approach to human beings sounds monstrous to modern ears, and it was monstrous. but it was also utterly typical of Washington's time and class. Virginia planters did not generally agonize over the morality of slavery. It was simply how things were done, as natural as the changing seasons or the flow of the Potomac. The moral arguments against slavery existed, certainly, and Washington would eventually encounter them. But in the 1760s and 1770s, he showed no sign of questioning the system that had made him wealthy. What distinguished Washington from many of his fellow slaveholders was not moral superiority but practical attention. He was a hands-on manager who knew the names, skills, and characteristics of the people he owned. His farm records include detailed observations about individual workers, who were skilled at carpentry, who was reliable with livestock, who tended to shirk their duties, who was frequently ill. This attention was primarily economic rather than humanitarian. Washington wanted to maximize the productivity of his workforce, which required understanding each worker's capabilities and limitations. But it also meant that he saw the enslaved people at Mount Vernon as individuals rather than interchangeable units of labor. The skills of the enslaved workers at Mount Vernon were considerable and essential to the estate's operation. Washington employed enslaved carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, weavers, seamstresses, cooks, gardeners, and agricultural workers of every description. Some of these workers possessed expertise that would have commanded high wages in a free labor market, skills passed down through generations or acquired through years of practice. The blacksmith who forged tools and shod horses, the cook who prepared meals for the Washington family and their endless stream of guests, the seamstress who made and maintained clothing for hundreds of people. These were not unskilled laborers, but craftspeople whose abilities Washington recognized and relied upon. This recognition, however, did not translate into anything resembling equality or respect for their humanity. The same records that noted a worker's skills also tracked their discipline problems, their attempts to escape, and their market value. Washington bought and sold human beings when it suited his purposes, broke up families when economics demanded, and used the full range of punishments available to slaveholders: whipping, deprivation, the threat of sale to the harsh sugar plantations of the Caribbean to maintain control over his workforce. He was not unusually cruel by the standards of his time, but those standards were cruel indeed. The evolution of Washington's thinking about slavery is one of the more fascinating aspects of his moral development, though it is also one of the more frustrating. He began, as we have noted, with no apparent qualms about the institution. By the time of the Revolution, he was beginning to express private doubts. By the end of his life, he had concluded that slavery was morally wrong and should be gradually abolished. This evolution took roughly 40 years, during which time Washington continued to own hundreds of human beings and profit from their labor. The pace of his moral awakening, one might observe, was not exactly breathtaking. Several factors contributed to Washington's changing views. The Revolution itself, with its rhetoric of liberty and natural rights, forced him to confront the contradiction between the principles he was fighting for and the practices he maintained at home. How could he demand freedom from British tyranny, while denying freedom to the people who worked his fields? The question was inescapable, and Washington was too intelligent to avoid it entirely. His letters from this period show him wrestling with the problem, though never quite arriving at a solution that would require immediate action. Exposure to anti-slavery arguments also played a role. Washington met Quakers and other abolitionists who challenged the institution directly, presenting moral and religious arguments against human bondage that were difficult to dismiss. He read the emerging literature of the anti-slavery movement and discussed the issue with correspondents who held a range of views. His close friendship with the Marquis de Lafayette, who was passionately opposed to slavery, may have influenced his thinking as well. Lafayette repeatedly urged Washington to free his slaves and join the abolitionist cause, but Washington always demurred, citing practical difficulties and political complications. The practical difficulties were real, though they were also convenient excuses. Many of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon belonged not to Washington personally, but to the Custis estate, meaning they would eventually pass to Martha's grandchildren, rather than remaining under George's control. He could not legally free these people even if he wanted to. The enslaved people he did own outright had often formed families with those belonging to the Custis estate, creating human bonds that would be cruelly severed by any partial emancipation. Washington used these complications to justify inaction, telling himself that the situation was too complex for simple solutions. There was also the matter of economics. Freeing his slaves would have meant dismantling the labor force that made Mount Vernon profitable. Washington was wealthy on paper, but much of that wealth was tied up in land and human property rather than liquid assets. Emancipation would have required restructuring his entire economic existence, hiring free laborers at market wages, and accepting a significant reduction in his standard of living. Washington was willing to sacrifice much for his principles. His military service proved that, but he was apparently not willing to sacrifice his prosperity for the freedom of the people he owned. The moral gymnastics required to maintain this position must have been exhausting. Washington wrote about his desire to see slavery abolished gradually, through legislative action rather than individual manumission. He expressed hope that future generations would find a way to end the institution that his generation could not. He convinced himself that he was treating his enslaved workers well, providing them with food, clothing, and shelter in exchange for their labor, as if this somehow balanced the scales of justice. These were the rationalizations of a man who knew, deep down, that what he was doing was wrong, but who could not bring himself to pay the price of making it right. The lived experience of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon is difficult to reconstruct in detail, because they left few records in their own voices. What we know comes primarily from Washington's records, farm reports, inventories, correspondence, which present the perspective of the master rather than the enslaved. From these documents we can piece together something of their daily lives, the work they did, the food they ate, the clothing they wore, the cabins they lived in. But their inner lives, their hopes, fears, loves, and sorrows, remain largely inaccessible, hidden behind the impersonal language of property management. We do know that resistance was constant, if usually subtle. Enslaved workers at Mount Vernon slowed their work, feigned illness, broke tools, and found countless small ways to assert their humanity against a system designed to deny it. Some escaped, or tried to. Washington's records include references to runaways and the efforts to recapture them. The famous case of Ona Judge, Martha's personal maid who escaped to freedom during Washington's presidency and refused all inducements to return, illustrates both the courage of those who sought freedom and the persistence of their owners in trying to reclaim them. Washington pursued Ona Judge for years, unable to accept that a person he considered his property had asserted her right to self-ownership. The relationship between Washington and individual enslaved workers varied considerably. Some, like his personal valet William Lee, occupied positions of relative privilege and apparent trust. Lee accompanied Washington throughout the Revolutionary War, was present at every major battle, and was the only enslaved person specifically freed in Washington's will. With an immediate grant of freedom rather than the delayed emancipation that applied to others, this special treatment suggests a genuine personal bond, though one fundamentally distorted by the power dynamics of slavery. Lee was loyal to Washington, certainly, but what choice did he have? The appearance of affection between master and slave was always shadowed by the violence that underwrote the relationship. Other enslaved workers at Mount Vernon lived harder lives, performing agricultural labor under overseers who were not always gentle. Washington's instructions to his overseers reveal the tensions inherent in managing unfree labor. He wanted maximum productivity, but worried about excessive cruelty that might damage his property or provoke resistance. He criticized overseers who were too harsh and those who were too lenient, seeking a middle ground that would extract labor efficiently without generating the resentment that led to sabotage or escape. This middle ground, if it existed at all, was a narrow path through moral quicksand. The women and children among the enslaved population at Mount Vernon faced particular vulnerabilities that Washington's records barely acknowledge. Women performed field labor alongside men, but they also bore children, nursed infants, and maintained households, all while subject to the sexual exploitation that was endemic to slavery. Children were born into bondage, their fates determined by the accident of their mother's status. Washington's records track these births with the same matter-of-fact tone used for livestock breeding, noting new additions to his workforce without apparent reflection on the humanity of the infants being catalogued. Family life among the enslaved was precarious, constantly threatened by the possibility of sale or transfer. Washington generally tried to keep families together, both from humanitarian impulse and from practical recognition that separated families were more likely to attempt escape. But economic necessity sometimes overrode these concerns, and Washington did sell individuals away from their families when circumstances seemed to require it. The terror of the auction block hung over every enslaved family at Mount Vernon, a constant reminder that their bonds could be severed at their owner's whim. As Washington aged and his moral doubts deepened, he found himself increasingly trapped by the system he had participated in building. He could not free his slaves during his lifetime without impoverishing himself and Martha. He could not free the Custis dower slaves at all, since they belonged to Martha's first husband's estate. He could not even publicly advocate for abolition without undermining his political influence and alienating the Southern allies whose support was essential to the new nation's survival. The founding father, who could have used his enormous prestige to strike a blow against slavery instead, remained silent. His private doubts never translated into public action. The solution Washington eventually arrived at, freeing his slaves in his will to take effect after Martha's death, was better than nothing but fell far short of moral heroism. It meant that he would never have to live with the consequences of emancipation, never have to rebuild Mount Vernon with free labor, never have to face the formerly enslaved as free people with claims on his conscience. Martha, predictably, found the prospect of living surrounded by people who were counting the days until her death sufficiently disturbing that she freed them early, about a year after George died. This was probably wise from a personal safety standpoint, though it did nothing to address the underlying injustice. The approximately 123 enslaved people who gained their freedom under Washington's will found themselves facing a world that was not particularly welcoming to free black Americans. Some stayed at or near Mount Vernon, working as hired laborers. Others scattered, seeking opportunities in a society that offered few. Washington's will provided for the support of those too old or too young to support themselves, and this provision was apparently honoured, but the newly freed faced formidable obstacles in building lives as free people. Freedom, it turned out, was only the beginning of the struggle. The legacy of Washington's slaveholding is complicated and uncomfortable, as it should be. He was a product of his time, certainly, but he was also a man of exceptional intelligence and moral seriousness who chose, year after year, to participate in a system he increasingly recognized as wrong. The evolution of his thinking deserves some credit. Many of his contemporaries never evolved at all. But the pace of that evolution and his failure to act on his convictions during his lifetime remain troubling. He was the father of his country, but he was also the master of hundreds of people whose freedom he valued less than his own comfort and prosperity. We cannot resolve these contradictions by pretending they did not exist. Washington was both the champion of liberty and the owner of slaves, and neither identity cancels out the other. Understanding him requires holding both truths simultaneously, acknowledging the genuine greatness of his public achievements, while never forgetting the private injustice on which they were built. This is uncomfortable, but discomfort is sometimes the appropriate response to history. When George Washington married Martha Custis in January 1759, he acquired not only a wealthy wife and a magnificent estate, but also 2 small children who had lost their father and now looked to him for guidance, discipline, and love. John Parke Custis, called Jackie, was 4 years old. Martha Parke, neither of them had chosen this new arrangement, and neither of them could have predicted how profoundly it would shape their short lives. Washington approached stepfatherhood with the same methodical determination he brought to everything else, which was both his strength and his limitation. He was not a natural with children. His reserve, his high expectations, his difficulty with emotional expression all worked against easy intimacy with young people. But he was dutiful, and he threw himself into the role of father with characteristic thoroughness. He would provide for these children, educate them, prepare them for their places in Virginia society. Whether he would actually connect with them emotionally was another question entirely. Jackie, the elder child and only son, became the primary focus of Washington's paternal ambitions and frustrations. The boy had been spoiled during his early childhood, first by an indulgent father and then by a grieving mother who perhaps compensated for loss with leniency. By the time Washington entered the picture, Jackie's character was already formed in ways that would prove resistant to correction. He was charming, certainly. Contemporary accounts describe him as likable and good-natured. But he was also lazy, undisciplined, and apparently allergic to sustained intellectual effort. This was not a combination likely to endear him to a stepfather who valued hard work, self-improvement, and the careful cultivation of reputation. Washington's letters about Jackie's education reveal a mounting frustration that never quite boiled over into outright anger, but never resolved into acceptance either. He sent the boy to the best schools available, hired tutors, purchased books, and wrote lengthy letters of advice and exhortation. The results were consistently disappointing. Jackie drifted through his education with the cheerful unconcern of a young man who knew he would inherit a fortune regardless of his academic performance. Why study Latin when you already have more money than most people will ever see? Why master mathematics when overseers can be hired to manage your estates? These were not questions Jackie articulated directly, but his behaviour suggested he had answered them to his own satisfaction. The contrast between Washington's expectations and Jackie's performance created a tension that persisted throughout their relationship. Washington believed in the power of education to shape character, in the importance of self-discipline and improvement, in the possibility of becoming better through sustained effort. Jackie believed in having a good time, and he was remarkably successful at it. Their letters to each other read like communications from different planets. Washington earnest and demanding, Jackie evasive and charming, neither quite understanding what the other was about. The schools Jackie attended provided excellent opportunities for advancement that he cheerfully ignored. His tutors reported that he was intelligent enough but simply would not apply himself. He preferred socializing to studying, hunting to homework, dancing to declension. Washington responded to these reports with letters that combined disappointment, advice, and barely concealed exasperation. He urged Jackie to take his studies seriously, to think about his future, to develop the qualities that would make him a respected member of Virginia society. Jackie responded with promises to do better that never quite materialized into actual improvement. Martha, caught between her husband and her son, did what she could to smooth the relationship. She understood Jackie in ways that George never could. He was her child, after all, and she loved him unconditionally in a way that step-parents rarely manage. She made excuses for his failures, emphasized his good qualities, and tried to help George see that not everyone could meet his exacting standards. This mediation probably prevented the relationship from deteriorating further, but it could not bridge the fundamental gap between Washington's hopes and Jackie's reality. The situation came to a head in 1773, when Jackie announced his intention to marry Eleanor Calvert, a young woman from a respectable Maryland family. He was 18 years old, had accomplished essentially nothing, and was clearly unprepared for the responsibilities of marriage and family. Washington was appalled. He had hoped that a few more years of education might finally instill some maturity in his stepson, and now that plan was being derailed by romantic impulse. The letters he wrote opposing the match reveal both his frustration with Jackie and his genuine concern for the boy's future. He did not want to see his stepson make a mistake that would shape the rest of his life. But Jackie was determined, and Martha was supportive, and Washington ultimately could not prevent a marriage between two people of legal age whose families approved of the match. The wedding took place in early 1774, and Jackie settled into life as a wealthy young husband with no particular occupation or ambition. He and Eleanor would have 4 children in quick succession, demonstrating that Jackie could at least apply himself in some areas. Washington watched this domestic proliferation with mixed feelings. Grandchildren were a blessing, certainly, but they did nothing to address his concerns about Jackie's character and direction. The Revolutionary War provided Jackie with an opportunity to prove himself that he characteristically failed to seize fully. While his stepfather commanded the Continental Army, Jackie remained in Virginia, tending to his estates and starting his family. He showed no particular inclination toward military service, which distinguished him from many young men of his class who eagerly sought glory on the battlefield. Washington did not pressure him to serve. The army was a hard life, and Jackie's death would have devastated Martha. But the contrast between stepfather's sacrifice and stepson's comfort could not have escaped notice. Near the end of the war in 1781, Jackie finally decided to join Washington's staff as a volunteer aide during the siege of Yorktown. This was a relatively safe way to participate in the war's climactic moment, and Jackie acquitted himself adequately in his limited role. But the camp was rife with disease, and Jackie contracted what was probably typhoid fever shortly after the British surrender. He died in November 1781, just weeks after his moment of military glory, leaving behind a young widow and 4 small children. Washington was genuinely grief-stricken by Jackie's death, despite all their conflicts and disappointments. He had been the boy's father for more than 20 years, had invested enormous energy in trying to shape him into a worthy successor, and had ultimately come to accept him as he was rather than as he wished him to be. The death was sudden and shocking, robbing Washington of any chance for final reconciliation or understanding. Martha's grief was even more profound. She had now lost all 4 of her biological children, and only the 2 youngest grandchildren, whom she and George would raise as their own, remained to console her. The relationship between Washington and Jackie illustrates something important about the limits of parental influence. Washington tried everything he knew to mold his stepson into a serious, accomplished young man. He provided excellent education, wise advice, abundant resources, and the example of his own tireless work ethic. None of it made much difference. Jackie remained Jackie, amiable, lazy, charming, and utterly resistant to improvement. The experience must have been humbling for a man who believed so strongly in the power of effort and determination to shape outcomes. Patsy, Martha's daughter, presented a very different set of challenges. Unlike her brother, she was not a discipline problem. Contemporary accounts describe her as sweet-tempered, affectionate, and eager to please, the kind of child who would have brought joy to any household. But Patsy suffered from epilepsy, a condition that was poorly understood in the 18th century and essentially untreatable. Her seizures began in childhood and grew progressively worse as she approached adolescence, eventually becoming so frequent and severe that she could not participate in normal social life. Washington's response to Patsy's illness reveals a softer side of his character than he often displayed. He genuinely loved the girl and was deeply pained by her suffering. He consulted every physician who might offer hope, tried every remedy that was recommended, and spent considerable sums seeking treatments that proved uniformly ineffective. His letters about Patsy's condition are filled with the helpless anguish of a parent watching a child suffer without being able to do anything about it. The treatments available for epilepsy in the 18th century range from useless to actively harmful. Doctors prescribed various medicines, mercury compounds, herbal concoctions, mineral waters, none of which had any effect on the underlying condition. They recommended dietary changes, lifestyle modifications, and what would now be called alternative therapies. Washington tried them all, travelling with Patsy to various springs and spas that were reputed to have healing properties. Nothing helped. The seizures continued, growing worse with each passing year. The impact on the household was significant. Patsy's condition required constant attention and supervision. She could not. Martha devoted herself to her daughter's care, watching over her with the tireless attention of a mother who knows her child's time may be limited. Washington supported these efforts, never complaining about the expense or inconvenience, always hoping that the next treatment might be the one that finally worked. The end came suddenly in June 1773. Patsy was having dinner with the family. She had seemed well enough that day, no worse than usual, when she suffered a seizure and died almost immediately. She was 17 years old. The quickness of her death was perhaps a mercy. She did not suffer a prolonged decline, but it left her parents with no time to prepare, no chance to say goodbye, no gradual acceptance of the inevitable. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone. Washington's response to Patsy's death was one of the most emotional displays of his life. He wrote to friends and family describing his grief in terms that were unusually direct for such a reserved man. He stayed close to Martha in the days following the death, providing what comfort he could to a woman who had now buried 3 of her 4 children. The loss seemed to draw them closer together, united in sorrow as they had been united in hope during the years of seeking treatment. The contrast between Washington's relationships with his 2 stepchildren illuminates different aspects of his character. With Jackie, he was the demanding father, always pushing for improvement, always disappointed by the gap between expectation and reality. With Patsy, he was the tender protector, doing everything in his power to help a child who could not be helped. Neither relationship gave him what he might have wished: success in moulding a worthy heir, or the joy of watching a beloved daughter grow into healthy adulthood. But both relationships were genuine, marked by real investment of time, energy, and emotion. The grandchildren who came to live at Mount Vernon after Jackie's death, Eleanor Park Custis and George Washington Park Custis, gave Washington a second chance at parenting, and he approached it somewhat differently than he had approached his stepchildren. He was older now, perhaps mellowed by experience and loss. The grandchildren knew him as grandpapa rather than as a demanding stepfather, and the relationship had a warmth that his connection with Jackie had often lacked. Whether he had learned from his earlier failures or simply found it easier to love children who were not his direct responsibility is impossible to say, but the grandchildren seemed to have brought him genuine happiness in his final years. The family life that Washington built with Martha was not the one either of them had imagined when they married. They had no children of their own, and the children Martha brought to the marriage both died young. Patsy at 17, Jackie at 27. The grandchildren they raised were consolation prizes, beloved certainly, but reminders of loss as much as sources of joy. Yet they made something of this imperfect family, found meaning and connection in relationships that circumstances had complicated but not destroyed. Washington the stepfather was neither a complete success nor a complete failure. He provided for Jackie and Patsy materially, gave them access to education and opportunity, and tried, in his reserved, demanding way, to prepare them for adult life. That Jackie squandered these opportunities was disappointing but not unusual. That Patsy never had the chance to use them was tragic but not Washington's fault. He did what he could with the situation he found himself in, which is perhaps all any parent can do. The experience of stepfatherhood shaped Washington in ways that are difficult to measure but probably significant. He learned something about the limits of control, about the impossibility of imposing one's will on other people, even when one has authority over them. He learned about loss, about the grief that comes from watching children suffer and die. He learned about the complicated love that develops between adults and children who have not chosen each other but must somehow become family. These lessons would serve him in his later roles, as commander of men who had not chosen to follow him, as president of a nation that had not unanimously elected him. The patience, the acceptance, the ability to work with imperfect people toward imperfect outcomes, these were skills that stepfatherhood helped develop. As we leave this chapter of Washington's private life, we carry with us images of a household more complicated than the idealized portraits suggest. Here was a family marked by love and frustration, hope and disappointment, connection and loss. Here was a man who wanted to be a good father and sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed, but never stopped trying. Here was a woman who lost nearly all her children but found ways to keep loving, keep hoping, keep building family from whatever materials were available. They were not the perfect family of national mythology. They were something more interesting, a real family with all the messiness and heartbreak that implies. The story continues, as stories do, with more chapters yet to explore. Washington's unexpected passions, Martha's central role in his success, the daily disciplines that structured his life, these await us ahead. But for now, we have seen something important about who this man was when he was not commanding armies or presiding over nations. He was a stepfather who tried his best, a husband who shared his wife's griefs, a man who learned from failure even when he could not prevent it. The house at Mount Vernon held all these stories within its walls, the laughter and the tears, the hopes and the disappointments, the ordinary dramas of family life that continued regardless of what was happening in the wider world. Washington walked those halls carrying all of this with him, the private man behind the public figure, the father and husband and grandfather behind the general and president. And somewhere in those memories, Jackie's careless smile and Patsy's gentle spirit remained, reminders of what had been lost and what had been loved. But let us return, before we move on, to the question that underlies both of these chapters, the question of how George Washington lived with contradiction. For the themes of slavery and stepfatherhood, different as they are, share something in common. They both reveal a man struggling with situations he could not fully control, making compromises between his ideals and his circumstances, living with imperfection because perfection was not available. The contradiction of the slaveholding patriot has troubled Americans for generations, and it should. Washington fought for liberty while denying it to hundreds of people. He spoke of natural rights while treating human beings as property. He evolved toward opposition to slavery but never took decisive action during his lifetime. These are facts that cannot be explained away, and we diminish ourselves if we try. But they are also facts that existed within a life of genuine complexity, and understanding that complexity, without excusing it, is part of understanding who Washington actually was. The failure of the demanding stepfather is a smaller matter certainly, but it illuminates something similar about Washington's character. He wanted Jackie to become something the boy was not equipped or inclined to become. He pushed and prodded and exhorted, and none of it made much difference. Eventually he learned to accept what he could not change, to love his stepson as he was rather than as he wished him to be. This acceptance did not come easily to a man who believed so strongly in the power of will and effort, but it came eventually, and it represented a kind of growth. In both cases, slavery and stepfatherhood, Washington was confronted with the limits of his own agency. He could not simply will slavery out of existence, could not snap his fingers and transform the entire economic and social system that had shaped Virginia for generations. He could not simply will Jackie into becoming a serious, disciplined young man, could not override the boy's nature through parental authority alone. These limitations frustrated him, as limitations always do, but they also taught him something about humility, about the gap between intention and outcome, about the need to work with the world as it is rather than as we wish it to be. The enslaved people at Mount Vernon and the stepchildren he tried to raise represent different categories of relationship, obviously. One involves a profound injustice that Washington never adequately addressed. The other involves the ordinary challenges of family life. We should not conflate them or treat them as morally equivalent, but both required Washington to navigate situations where his authority, however considerable, was not sufficient to produce the outcomes he wanted. And both reveal something about how he responded to that experience of limitation. His response in both cases was to do what he thought was possible while deferring what he thought was impossible. He would manage slavery humanely by his lights, while waiting for society to find a way to abolish it. He would provide Jackie with opportunity and guidance while accepting that the boy would ultimately make his own choices. These were not heroic positions, but they were realistic ones, and Washington was nothing if not a realist. He dealt with the world as he found it, made what improvements he could, and left the rest to Providence and future generations. Whether this realism was wisdom or cowardice depends largely on one's perspective. Those who value practical achievement over moral purity might admire Washington's ability to work within constraints, to accomplish what was possible without being paralyzed by what was impossible. Those who value moral consistency might condemn his willingness to compromise with injustice, his failure to sacrifice his own interest for his principles. Both perspectives have merit, and Washington himself seems to have felt the pull of both throughout his life. The enslaved people whose labor built Mount Vernon and the stepchildren who grew up within its walls were all, in their different ways, dependent on George Washington's decisions. He held enormous power over their lives, power of life and death over the enslaved, power to shape and direct for the children. How he exercised that power reveals his character more fully than any battlefield victory or political achievement. And what we see, when we look closely, is a man who was neither monster nor saint but something more interesting. A flawed human being trying to navigate impossible situations with the limited wisdom available to him. Martha's role in all of this deserves more attention than it sometimes receives. She was present for everything: the daily management of enslaved workers, the struggles with Jackie's education, the years of caring for Patsy, the grief when both children died. She was not a passive observer but an active participant, making decisions alongside her husband, influencing his thinking, providing the emotional warmth that his reserve sometimes made difficult. The Washington household was a partnership, and Martha's contributions were essential even when they went unrecorded. Her feelings about slavery are largely unknown. She left even fewer records than George, but she was certainly complicit in the system. The domestic servants who made her life comfortable, the seamstresses who made her clothes, the cooks who prepared her meals, these were enslaved women whose labor she directed and from whose bondage she benefited. She apparently felt no moral qualms that we know of, accepting slavery as simply part of the world she had been born into. This acceptance makes her no different from most white Virginians of her era. But it reminds us that the sins of the slaveholding class were not George Washington's alone. With her children, Martha was the counterbalance to George's demanding expectations. She loved Jackie unconditionally, defended him against criticism, and helped smooth his relationship with his stepfather. She devoted herself to Patsy's care with the tireless attention of a mother who knows her child's time is limited. When both children died, she bore the grief with the strength that would later sustain her through the hardships of war and politics. Her capacity for loss seems almost superhuman in retrospect. 4 children dead, a husband who was constantly being called away to danger, the ordinary sorrows of life compounded by extraordinary circumstances. The household they built together at Mount Vernon was not perfect, but it was functional, and it provided the foundation on which Washington's public career was constructed. Without Martha managing the domestic sphere, George could not have devoted himself so completely to military and political affairs. Without the wealth that slavery provided, neither of them would have had the resources to sustain their public roles. Without the experience of stepfatherhood, George might never have developed the patience and acceptance that leadership eventually required. Everything was connected: the public and the private, the admirable and the shameful, the successes and the failures. We who look back from a distance of more than 2 centuries can see patterns that those living through the events could not perceive. We can trace the evolution of Washington's thinking about slavery, note the moments when doubt began to emerge, observe the gradual development of the conviction that eventually led to posthumous emancipation. We can see how his experiences with Jackie and Patsy shaped his approach to the grandchildren he later raised, how failure taught him lessons that success never could. We have the advantage of knowing how the story ended, which makes it easier to identify the threads that led to that ending. But for Washington, living through these years, there was no such clarity. He faced each day's decisions without knowing where they would lead, made choices based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes, hoped for the best while preparing for the worst. The contradictions we perceive so clearly were, for him, simply the texture of daily life. Problems to be managed rather than paradoxes to be resolved. He did not wake up each morning thinking about the inconsistency between his principles and his practices. He woke up thinking about what needed to be done that day, and he did it. This is perhaps the most human thing about George Washington, not his greatness, which sets him apart, but his ordinariness, which connects him to everyone who has ever struggled with impossible situations and imperfect choices. He was a slaveholder who knew slavery was wrong. He was a stepfather who could not reach his stepson. He was a man who wanted to do right and often fell short. These failures do not cancel his achievements, but they do complicate them, and the complication is what makes him interesting rather than merely admirable. The night has grown deep now, and we have travelled through difficult territory, the moral wilderness of slavery, the emotional challenges of blended family life. These are not comfortable subjects, but they are essential to understanding who Washington really was. He was not the marble statue, immune to contradiction and complexity. He was a man, with a man's limitations and a man's capacity for both good and ill. The journey continues from here into lighter territory, unexpected passions, daily routines, the places where Washington went to be himself rather than his public image. But we carry with us now a fuller picture of the private man, shaped by experiences that the history books often neglect. He was a slaveholder. He was a stepfather. He was, for better and worse, thoroughly human. Let that humanity accompany you as sleep approaches. The story is not finished, but this chapter is complete. The image of George Washington that has come down to us through the centuries is, let us be honest, rather stiff. We picture him in those formal portraits, powdered wig perfectly arranged, expression carefully neutral, posture suggesting that he might have swallowed a particularly rigid piece of furniture. This is the Washington of textbooks and currency, the marble man who never cracked a smile and probably considered fun to be a character flaw. But this image, while not entirely false, misses something important about who Washington actually was. Behind that famously reserved exterior lurked a man with genuine passions, unexpected enthusiasms, and a capacity for joy that rarely made it into the official biographies. Let's start with dancing, because nothing shatters the marble man image quite like picturing George Washington cutting a rug. And he did cut a rug, with evident enthusiasm well into his 50s. Contemporary accounts describe him as an excellent dancer, graceful, energetic, and possessed of the kind of natural rhythm that cannot be taught. He attended balls and assemblies whenever opportunity permitted, and he did not merely attend as a dignified presence watching from the sidelines. He danced. For hours. With multiple partners. With what witnesses described as obvious enjoyment. This passion for dancing was not considered unusual for a Virginia gentleman of his era. Social dancing was an essential skill for anyone who wished to move in polite society. But Washington's enthusiasm went beyond mere social obligation. He genuinely loved it. The music, the movement, the opportunity to interact with others in a structured yet joyful way, all of this appealed to something in his nature that his more famous qualities tended to obscure. The reserved commander, the dignified president, the careful farmer, these were real aspects of Washington's character. But so was the man who could dance for 3 hours straight and emerge wanting more. The specific dances of Washington's era would seem rather formal to modern eyes. Minuets, country dances, reels, and jigs, all performed according to established patterns and rules. This was not freestyle expression but choreographed movement, which perhaps suited Washington's temperament perfectly. He liked order and structure in most areas of his life. Dancing provided both while also allowing for the physical exertion and social interaction that he clearly craved. The rules gave him a framework within which he could relax, move, and even enjoy himself, without abandoning the self-control that was so central to his identity. Martha shared his enthusiasm for dancing, which must have been convenient for their marriage. They attended balls together, danced together, and apparently enjoyed these social occasions as a couple. The image of George and Martha Washington taking the floor at a Virginia assembly, moving through the figures of a country dance with practiced grace, is not the sort of picture that usually accompanies discussions of the Founding Fathers. But it should be, because it reveals something true about who they were, not just public figures burdened with historical significance, but actual people who like to have a good time when circumstances permitted. Washington's love of dancing persisted even as age and responsibility accumulated. During the Revolutionary War, when circumstances allowed, he attended balls and danced with officers' wives and local ladies. During his presidency, he and Martha hosted formal levees where dancing was a central entertainment. He was in The dancing president is not the image we usually carry of Washington's administration, but it is historically accurate, and it humanizes a figure who is too often reduced to his most serious moments. Theatre was another passion that the marble man image tends to obscure. Washington loved plays, loved attending them, loved discussing them, loved the whole experience of theatrical entertainment. Whenever his duties brought him to cities where theatre was available, Philadelphia, New York, Williamsburg, he made time to attend performances. His diaries and letters contain numerous references to plays he saw, actors he admired, and productions he particularly enjoyed. This was not passive cultural consumption, but genuine enthusiasm for a form of entertainment that brought him pleasure. The 18th century theatre that Washington enjoyed was rather different from modern productions, more declamatory, more formal, often featuring the same classic plays performed again and again with different casts. Shakespeare was popular, as were various comedies and tragedies drawn from English and classical sources. The productions were not always polished by modern standards, touring companies making do with limited resources, local amateurs filling roles that professionals were not available to play, but Washington did not seem to mind. He appreciated theatre for what it offered: escape, entertainment, the pleasure of watching skilled performers bring stories to life. There is something slightly incongruous about picturing the father of his country sitting in a theatre audience, watching actors strut and fret upon the stage, perhaps laughing at comic scenes or feeling moved by tragic ones. We want our founding fathers to have been perpetually serious, always focused on the weighty matters of state that would define their legacies. But Washington, like any human being, needed respite from seriousness. Theatre provided that respite, offering a few hours of transported attention during which the burdens of command and leadership could be temporarily set aside. His enthusiasm for theatre continued throughout his life. During the presidency, he attended performances in New York and Philadelphia with some regularity, often accompanied by Martha and other family members. These visits were not merely ceremonial. Washington genuinely wanted to see the plays and did not simply show up to be seen. The actors and theatre managers of the young republic were probably delighted to have the president in their audiences, though one suspects Washington would have preferred to attend without the fuss that his presence inevitably created. But of all Washington's passions, none was more intense or more central to his identity than his love of horses and riding. This was not merely a practical skill, though riding was certainly essential for travel, farming, and military command in his era. This was a deep emotional connection to horses that bordered on the spiritual. Washington on horseback was, by all accounts, something to see. A natural rider who seemed to merge with his mount, controlling the animal through subtle communication that observers found almost magical. Contemporary descriptions of Washington's horsemanship are remarkably consistent in their admiration. Thomas Jefferson, not generally given to effusive praise of others, called Washington the best horseman of his age. Others described him as seeming almost born in the saddle, possessing an instinctive understanding of horses that went beyond mere technical skill. He could calm a nervous horse with his presence, control a spirited mount without apparent effort, and ride for hours without fatigue that would have exhausted lesser equestrians. The physical dimensions of Washington's relationship with horses deserve attention. He was a large man, 6 feet 2 inches tall at a time when the average man stood around 5'7", and he needed large, strong horses to carry him comfortably. He bred horses at Mount Vernon, always seeking animals that combined size, strength, and temperament suited to his needs. His favourite mounts were famous in their own right, recognised by name among Virginia's horse-loving gentry. Blueskin and Nelson, his 2 primary war horses during the Revolution, were celebrities of a sort, known throughout the army as the commander's trusted companions. Nelson in particular deserves mention because he illustrates something important about Washington's bond with his horses. This chestnut horse carried Washington through much of the Revolutionary War, remaining calm under fire in a way that was essential for a commander who needed to maintain his position during battles. Nelson had been trained to ignore the sounds of muskets and cannons, to stand steady when other horses would bolt, to trust his rider completely. The relationship between Washington and Nelson was one of mutual dependence. The general needed a reliable mount, and the horse needed a rider capable of commanding such respect. When Nelson retired from military service after the war, Washington brought him to Mount Vernon to live out his days in comfort. The horse was never put to work again, allowed to graze peacefully in the pastures while younger animals took over the duties he had performed so faithfully. This was not merely sentiment, though sentiment certainly played a role, but recognition of a debt owed. Nelson had served well, and Washington believed he deserved a comfortable retirement. The horse outlived his master by several years, dying in 1790, a respected veteran of the revolution that had created a nation. Washington's daily riding at Mount Vernon was not just transportation but therapy. He would rise before dawn and ride out to inspect his farms, covering miles of terrain before most people had finished breakfast. These morning rides were essential to his mental health. They provided exercise, allowed him to survey his property, and gave him time alone with his thoughts before the day's demands began. The rhythm of hoofbeats, the feel of a good horse moving beneath him, the fresh morning air of Virginia, these were the elements of Washington's preferred meditation, his way of centering himself before facing whatever challenges awaited. The connection between Washington and his horses was also in some ways a connection to a simpler version of himself. On horseback, he was not the commander or the president or the public figure burdened with expectations. He was just a man riding a horse, engaged in an activity he had loved since childhood, experiencing the kind of uncomplicated pleasure that his complicated life rarely afforded. His horses did not care about his reputation or his responsibilities. They cared about being fed, being ridden well, being treated with the respect that any good horseman shows to his mount. This simplicity must have been refreshing for a man whose human relationships were so often fraught with political calculation and social expectation. Fox hunting was another passion that combined Washington's love of horses with his enjoyment of social activity and outdoor adventure. He kept a pack of hounds at Mount Vernon and organised hunts that brought together neighbours and friends for days of riding, chasing, and the particular camaraderie that develops among people pursuing a common quarry. These hunts were social events as much as sporting ones. They provided opportunities for Virginia gentlemen to see and be seen, to network and gossip, to demonstrate their horsemanship and their hospitality. Washington was apparently an excellent huntsman, capable of riding hard across difficult terrain while maintaining enough awareness to direct the overall chase. The foxes of Virginia probably did not appreciate Washington's enthusiasm for hunting them, but the activity served multiple purposes beyond mere sport. It kept Washington physically fit, provided social engagement with his neighbours, and satisfied something in his nature that required physical challenge and outdoor activity. The sedentary life was never for him. He needed to move, to exert himself, to feel his body working in coordination with a good horse beneath him. Hunting provided all of this while also reinforcing his status as a Virginia gentleman of the first rank. These passions, dancing, theatre, horses, hunting, reveal a George Washington quite different from the marble monument. Here was a man who sought pleasure and found it, who needed physical activity and emotional release, who was capable of enjoyment even amid the serious responsibilities that dominated his public life. The reserved exterior that he presented to the world was real, but it was not the whole story. Behind that careful facade was someone who could dance for hours, who laughed at comedies, who felt genuine love for the horses that carried him through war and peace. The contrast between public image and private passion tells us something important about Washington's character. He understood the power of presentation, the importance of maintaining dignity in public life, the need to appear steady and unflappable when others were watching. But he also understood that no one could maintain such an image constantly without going slightly mad. The passions we have explored in this chapter were his release valves, the ways he let off pressure, restored his equilibrium, and reminded himself that life contained pleasures as well as duties. Martha understood these needs and supported them. She danced with him at balls, attended theatre with him when possible, and never begrudged the hours he spent with his horses. A less understanding wife might have resented the time these activities consumed, might have pressured him to focus more completely on the serious business of farming or politics or whatever else demanded his attention. Martha seems to have recognized that George needed these outlets, that the passions which might have seemed frivolous to some observers were actually essential to his well-being. The horses in particular represented something that Martha could never fully share. She was not a rider of Washington's caliber, few people were, and his morning circuits of Mount Vernon were solitary activities from which she was necessarily excluded. But she does not seem to have resented this exclusion. She understood that her husband needed time alone, time with his horses, time in nature away from the demands of household and society. This understanding was part of what made their partnership work so well for so long. We have spoken much of George Washington in these chapters, his passions and contradictions, his achievements and failures, his public image and private self. But no account of Washington's private life can be complete without giving Martha her due. because she was not merely a supporting character in his story. She was a central figure in her own right, a woman of considerable ability and determination who shaped the Washington partnership as much as George did. If we have sometimes treated her as secondary, that is a failure of emphasis that this chapter will attempt to correct. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, to use her full name, brought to her marriage with George far more than wealth and social status, though she certainly brought those. She brought competence. She brought emotional intelligence. She brought a capacity for hard work that matched her husband's own. She brought the ability to manage complex domestic operations with the same systematic attention that George brought to his farms and military campaigns. In short, let us start with her management abilities, because these are often overlooked in accounts that focus on her role as hostess and helpmate. Running a household the size of Mount Vernon was not a decorative function. It was a demanding administrative job that required intelligence, organization, and attention to detail. Martha oversaw dozens of domestic workers, managed the storage and preparation of food for the family and their endless stream of guests, coordinated the production of clothing and household goods, maintained accounts, handled correspondence, and made thousands of small decisions each day that kept the household functioning smoothly. This was not dabbling in domesticity. This was serious management. The scale of her responsibilities is difficult to appreciate from a modern perspective. Mount Vernon's household included not just the Washington family, but numerous relatives, visitors, and servants whose needs had to be anticipated and met. The kitchen had to produce multiple meals each day for varying numbers of people, using ingredients that had to be grown, harvested, preserved, and stored according to seasons and circumstances. Clothing had to be made, maintained, and replaced for everyone on the estate, a constant cycle of spinning, weaving, cutting, and sewing that never ended. Medical care for the household fell largely under Martha's purview as well, requiring her to maintain supplies of medicines and knowledge of treatments for the various ailments that afflicted her charges. She accomplished all of this without the conveniences that modern household managers take for granted. No refrigeration, no electricity, no running water, no labor-saving appliances of any kind. Everything was done by hand, according to methods that had changed little for centuries. The amount of physical labor required simply to maintain a household was staggering by modern standards, and while Martha did not perform most of this labor herself, that fell to the enslaved workers she supervised. She bore responsibility for ensuring that it was done correctly and efficiently. The hospitality that Mount Vernon was famous for depended entirely on Martha's management. Virginia society expected wealthy planters to maintain open houses, welcoming visitors at any time and providing them with food, drink, and comfortable accommodations. The Washingtons entertained constantly. Barely a day passed without guests at their table, and some visits lasted for weeks. Martha handled all of this with apparent ease, creating an atmosphere of gracious plenty that made visitors feel welcome while never seeming to strain under the burden. The effort required to maintain this appearance of effortless hospitality must have been considerable, but Martha rarely complained, at least in writing. Her competence extended to financial management as well. As a wealthy widow before her marriage to George, Martha had experience running substantial estates on her own. She understood accounts, could evaluate the performance of overseers and managers, and was not intimidated by the complexities of plantation economics. When George was away, which was often given his military and political careers, Martha managed Mount Vernon capably, making decisions and handling problems that arose without waiting for her husband's guidance. She kept him informed through correspondence, certainly, but she did not require his approval for every action. She was trusted to manage, and she managed well. The emotional labor that Martha performed deserves equal attention, though it is harder to document than her practical contributions. She was the emotional center of the Washington household, providing warmth and stability that balanced George's reserve. Visitors consistently commented on her graciousness, her ability to put people at ease, her genuine interest in those she met. This was not mere performance, or if it was performance, it was sustained with remarkable consistency over decades. Martha seems to have genuinely liked people, and to have possessed the social skills necessary to make them feel valued and comfortable in her presence. For George, Martha's emotional support was essential in ways that he probably never fully articulated. He was not demonstrative by nature, not given to expressions of feeling that might reveal vulnerability. But he depended on Martha for emotional sustenance, the comfort of her presence, the security of her loyalty, the knowledge that someone understood and accepted him completely. When he was away during the war, he wrote to her constantly, expressing his longing to return and his worry about her well-being. When he finally came home, he sought her company with evident relief. She was his anchor, his harbour, the fixed point around which his turbulent public life revolved. The sacrifices Martha made for George's career were substantial, though she rarely complained about them publicly. She had not married him expecting to become a general's wife, much less a president's wife. She had expected to be a wealthy Virginia plantation mistress, enjoying a comfortable life of domestic management and social engagement. Instead, she found herself following her husband to military camps, living in rented houses in strange cities, performing public duties that she had never sought and did not particularly enjoy. She made these sacrifices because her husband needed her, because she was loyal to their partnership, and because she understood that some things mattered more than personal comfort. The winters she spent at military camps during the Revolutionary War illustrate her commitment most dramatically. Each year, when the fighting season ended and the army settled into winter quarters, Martha would make the long, difficult journey from Virginia to wherever George was encamped. These journeys took weeks, required travel over primitive roads in uncomfortable vehicles, and ended in accommodations that were a far cry from Mount Vernon's comforts. She endured all of this willingly, understanding that her presence was essential to her husband's morale and effectiveness. At camp, Martha did not merely provide George with companionship, she worked. She organised sewing circles among officers' wives, producing shirts and socks and bandages for the soldiers. She visited sick and wounded men, bringing what comfort she could to those suffering from illness or injury. She managed the social complexities of headquarters, serving as hostess for the steady stream of visitors, politicians and diplomats who sought audiences with the commander. Her role was not ceremonial but functional, contributing materially to the war effort, while also supporting her husband through the darkest years of his life. The presidency imposed similar burdens, though of a different nature. Martha became the First Lady of the United States, a role with no precedent, no job description, and no clear boundaries. The formal levees she hosted were criticized by some as too monarchical, too reminiscent of European court life, but they established patterns that future First Ladies would follow. She was setting precedents without knowing she was doing so, creating a role that would be filled by every president's wife for centuries to come. She did not enjoy it. Martha's letters from this period reveal a woman who felt trapped by her husband's position, longing for the quiet domestic life she had expected to live. She described herself as a state prisoner, confined by the demands of office to a life she had not chosen. But she did her duty, as she always did, because that was what the partnership required. Her complaints were private, shared with trusted correspondents rather than broadcast to the world. In public, she maintained the gracious, welcoming demeanour that visitors expected and that her role demanded. The partnership between George and Martha Washington was in many ways a model of 18th century marriage at its best. It was founded on practical considerations, wealth, status, mutual advantage, but it evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. They respected each other's abilities, supported each other's needs, and worked together toward shared goals with an effectiveness that made them both more successful than either could have been alone. This was not the passionate romance of novels, but it was perhaps something more durable, a working partnership between two capable people who had learned to rely on each other completely. Martha's influence on George extended beyond domestic management and emotional support to include genuine advice and counsel. He discussed matters with her, sought her opinions, and valued her perspective on issues ranging from household decisions to political questions. She was not a silent partner, but an active one, contributing her intelligence and judgment to the decisions that shaped their shared life. The exact nature and extent of her influence is difficult to determine. She left few records of her political views, and George was not in the habit of crediting others for his decisions. But those who knew them well understood that Martha was more than a decorative presence at her husband's side. The destruction of their correspondence after George's death was Martha's decision, and it reveals something important about how she viewed their partnership. She burned the letters because she wanted to protect their privacy, to prevent future generations from poring over the intimate details of their relationship. This was an act of devotion in a way. She was guarding their shared life from the intrusion of posterity. But it was also an act of assertion, a reminder that Martha had her own agency, her own preferences, her own determination about what the world should and should not know. She survived George by only 2.5 years, dying in May 1802. Those final years were lonely ones. She had lost the partner who had defined her adult life, and she showed little interest in the world beyond Mount Vernon. Visitors found her diminished, going through the motions of hospitality without the energy that had once characterized her social presence. She was ready to join George, she told people, and she seemed almost relieved when death finally came. The legacy of Martha Washington is complicated by the relative scarcity of sources and by the tendency of historians to focus on her husband's achievements rather than her own. But any honest assessment must acknowledge that George Washington's success was built on a foundation that Martha helped construct. She managed his household, raised his stepchildren, supported his ambitions, and provided the emotional stability that his temperament required. She sacrificed her own preferences for his career, endured hardships she had never anticipated, and maintained her commitment to their partnership through 40 years of marriage. Without Martha, George Washington would have been a different man, probably less successful, certainly less happy, possibly less capable of the sustained effort that his various careers required. She was not merely his wife but his partner, not merely his hostess but his counselor, not merely his comfort but his collaborator. The story of George Washington's private life is in many ways the story of their partnership, and any account that fails to give Martha her due is incomplete. As we near the end of our exploration of Washington's private world, let us carry this image of Martha with us, not the painted portrait of a placid colonial dame, but the living woman who managed, supported, sacrificed, and endured. She was remarkable in her own right, and she deserves to be remembered as more than an appendage to her famous husband. She was the architect of their family life, the builder of the domestic foundation on which all of George's public achievements rested. Without her, the father of his country might never have become what history required him to be. The partnership they built together at Mount Vernon, imperfect, complicated, shaped by the contradictions of their time, remains one of the most successful marriages in American history. It survived wealth and war, public service and private grief, the endless demands of a nation in formation, and the ordinary challenges of any long relationship. They made it work through mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to each other that never wavered despite whatever difficulties arose. And when it ended, with George's death in December 1799, Martha faced the world alone for the first time in 40 years. She had been a wife since the age of 18, first to Daniel Custis and then to George Washington. She had never known adult life without a husband, never had to define herself apart from her role as partner to someone else. The final years of her life were a coda to the partnership that had defined her existence, a quiet ending to a story that had been anything but quiet. She's buried beside George at Mount Vernon, together in death as they were in life. The tomb they share is simple by the standards of national monuments, just a brick vault on the grounds of the estate they loved, marked by a modest inscription. But it represents something larger than its physical dimensions suggest, the final resting place of a partnership that helped shape a nation. They lie there still, George and Martha Washington, the father of his country and the woman who made his greatness possible. The story continues forward from here, with chapters yet to explore about daily routines, places of retreat, and the peaceful moments before history claimed the Washingtons forever. But we have now met the full partnership, not just George in his complexity, but Martha in hers as well. They were a team, these two, and understanding either one requires understanding both. The fire burns steady, the night deepens, and Mount Vernon holds its memories close. Somewhere in those old walls, the echoes of their partnership still resonate. The sound of Martha's voice giving instructions to the household, the rhythm of George's boots on the stairs, the quiet moments they shared when the world was not watching. These were real people who lived real lives, and their story is not finished yet. But before we move forward, let us linger a moment longer on the unexpected passions and the partnership we have explored in these chapters, because they illuminate something important about what makes a life complete. They were essential components of a balanced existence, the counterweights that kept a heavily burdened man from collapsing under the pressure of his responsibilities. We often think of great historical figures as being consumed entirely by their great works, as if they existed only in the moments that made them famous. But Washington, like any human being, needed rest and recreation, pleasure and play. His passions gave him access to joy that his public role could not provide. The dancing Washington, graceful, energetic, enjoying himself on the ballroom floor, is not a contradiction of the serious commander or the dignified president. He is the same man, expressing a different aspect of a complex personality. The ability to move from gravity to levity, from the burdens of office to the pleasures of the dance floor, was not weakness but strength. It suggested a flexibility of spirit that served Washington well in contexts far removed from social entertainment. A man who could dance could also adapt, could also find lightness amid darkness, could also remember that life contained pleasures as well as duties. His horses offered something different, not social pleasure but solitary communion, not performance but partnership with creatures that asked nothing of him except competent horsemanship. The morning rides at Mount Vernon were not just exercise or farm inspection. They were meditation, restoration, a return to a simpler relationship than any human interaction could provide. Washington on horseback was Washington at his most authentic, engaged in an activity he had loved since childhood, connected to an animal that knew nothing of his fame or his responsibilities. The commander who worried about supplies and strategies, the president who navigated political treachery, could sit in a darkened theatre and simply watch, simply enjoy, simply be entertained. These passions humanize Washington in ways that his public achievements cannot. We can admire the general who won independence, respect the president who established precedents, appreciate the farmer who innovated agricultural practices, but we can identify with the man who loved to dance, who enjoyed a good play, who found peace on horseback. These are pleasures accessible to ordinary people, and they remind us that Washington, for all his extraordinary accomplishments, was not so different from the rest of us in his basic needs and desires. Martha's role as architect of their family life parallels and complements these passions in important ways. She created the domestic context within which George could pursue his enthusiasms, the stable home to which he returned from his morning rides, the social occasions at which they danced together, the comfortable household that made entertaining guests and attending theatre possible. Her management freed him to pursue the activities that restored his spirit, while her companionship gave many of those activities their deeper meaning. The partnership they built was not merely practical, though it was certainly that. It was also emotional, intellectual, and in some ways spiritual. They shared values, supported each other's well-being, and worked together toward goals that neither could have achieved alone. George's passions were enabled by Martha's competence. Martha's contributions were valued and supported by George's respect. This mutual enabling was the engine that drove their household forward through 4 decades of marriage. Consider what their life would have looked like without this partnership. George, passionate about horses and dancing and theatre, but without a competent manager to run his household while he indulged these interests. Martha, capable and intelligent, but without a husband who respected her abilities and gave her scope to exercise them. Each of them would have been diminished without the other, their individual strengths less effective without the complementary strengths their partner provided. The success of the Washington marriage was not accidental. It required ongoing attention, mutual accommodation, and the willingness to prioritize the partnership over individual preferences. When Martha followed George to military camps, she was putting the marriage first. When George supported Martha's management of Mount Vernon during his absences, he was acknowledging her competence and trusting her judgment. These were not isolated gestures, but patterns of behavior sustained over decades, habits of partnership that became second nature through repetition. Modern marriages often struggle with the challenge of balancing individual fulfillment against partnership demands. We want to pursue our passions, develop our abilities, achieve our goals, but we also want connection, support, the deep satisfaction of genuine partnership. The Washingtons faced this same challenge, though in the context of very different social expectations and gender roles. Their solution, a division of labour that gave each partner scope for their strengths while maintaining mutual support and respect, may not translate directly to modern circumstances, but the principles underlying it remain relevant. George needed his passions, the dancing, the theatre, the horses, to remain emotionally healthy and effective in his various roles. Martha needed meaningful work, the household management, the social hosting, the practical problem-solving, to feel valued and engaged. Their partnership gave each of them what they needed while creating something larger than either could have created alone. This is perhaps the definition of a successful marriage. 2 individuals who enhance rather than diminish each other, who find in partnership opportunities for flourishing that solitude could not provide. The specific forms their partnership took were shaped by the conventions of their era. Conventions that modern observers might find limiting or even oppressive. Martha's sphere was domestic. George's extended into the wider world of politics and war. She supported his public career. He provided the social position that made her domestic authority possible. These arrangements reflected 18th century assumptions about gender roles that we have largely moved beyond. But the underlying dynamic, mutual respect, complementary contributions, shared commitment to the partnership transcends historical context. What strikes me most, looking back at George and Martha Washington from across the centuries, is how much work they put into making their partnership succeed. It was not It was constructed, maintained, and renewed through decades of daily choices, small accommodations, and sustained attention. They chose each other every day, in effect, by the way they treated each other, the way they supported each other's needs, the way they prioritized their partnership over other possible priorities. George's passions and Martha's competence were both essential to this success. His need for physical activity, social pleasure, and connection with horses was balanced by her ability to create the stable domestic environment within which these needs could be met. Her need for meaningful work and respected contribution was balanced by his genuine appreciation of her abilities and his willingness to rely on her judgment. Neither subordinated their needs to the other entirely. Neither demanded that the other sacrifice their authentic self for the sake of the partnership. They found a way to be fully themselves while also being fully partners. This balance is perhaps the most valuable lesson their marriage has to offer across the centuries. In an era that often presents individual fulfillment and committed partnership as competing values, George and Martha Washington demonstrate that they need not be. Passions and partnership, personal authenticity and mutual accommodation, these apparent opposites can coexist in a well-constructed marriage. The key is mutual respect, complementary contributions, and the willingness to do the ongoing work that successful partnership requires. The night has grown late, and we have travelled far through the intimate landscape of Washington's private world. We have seen his unexpected passions and met the partner who enabled them. We have understood something of how their marriage worked and why it succeeded. We have glimpsed the private people behind the public monuments and found them to be recognisably human, complex, imperfect, struggling with the same challenges of balance and partnership that face anyone who attempts to build a shared life. The journey continues from here into daily routines and places of retreat, into the quiet moments that preceded the storms of revolution and nationhood. But they were hold that image as sleep approaches. Not the monuments, but the people. Not the icons, but the partners. George and Martha Washington, dancing together at a Virginia ball, managing their household through another demanding day, finding in each other the support and understanding that made everything else possible. Their story is not finished, but this chapter draws to a close. The next one awaits, with more revelations about the private man who became the public legend. If you want to understand George Washington, really understand him, not just admire him from the safe distance of historical reverence, you need to understand his relationship with time. And that relationship was, to put it mildly, intense. Washington did not merely use time, he commanded it, organized it, deployed it with the strategic precision of a general arranging troops on a battlefield. His daily routine was not a loose framework, but a detailed operational plan, executed with military exactness day after day, year after year, for his entire adult life. Modern productivity gurus would have loved George Washington. He was the original life hacker, the 18th century equivalent of those people who wake up at 4 a.m. to meditate, exercise, journal, and accomplish more before breakfast than most people manage in a week. Except Washington did not need apps or motivational podcasts to maintain his discipline. He had something more powerful, an internal drive toward order and efficiency that bordered on the compulsive. The man simply could not tolerate wasted time, and he structured his life to ensure that as little as possible was wasted. Let us walk through a typical day at Mount Vernon during the years of peaceful retirement that Washington treasured so deeply, keeping in mind that even retirement for this particular individual involved enough activity to exhaust most people half his age. The day began before dawn, well before dawn in fact. Washington was typically awake by 4 o'clock in the morning, rising in the darkness to begin his daily routine while most of the household still slept. This was not occasional early rising for special circumstances. This was every single day, regardless of season, weather, or the previous evening's activities. If Washington had attended a ball that kept him up until midnight, and he did attend such events as we have discussed, he would still be awake at 4 the next morning. The routine did not bend to accommodate late nights or early mornings. It simply was. The first hours of the day were devoted to private activities, dressing, perhaps some reading or reflection, preparation for the day ahead. Washington was meticulous about his personal appearance, not from vanity but from his understanding that presentation mattered. He dressed carefully, attended to his famously troublesome teeth, and prepared himself to be seen by others in a way that reflected well on his dignity and status. This was not quick work. 18th century gentleman's attire involved multiple layers, considerable buttoning, and attention to details that modern casual dress does not require. By the time dawn broke, Washington was ready for his morning ride. the inspection tour of Mount Vernon's 5 farms that was both exercise and estate management. He would mount his horse and set off across the property, covering miles of terrain while examining crops, checking on workers, noting problems that needed attention, and observing the condition of fields, fences, and livestock. This was not leisurely cantering through scenic landscapes. This was systematic inspection, conducted with the thoroughness of a military commander reviewing his troops. The morning ride served multiple purposes simultaneously, which was very much Washington's style. It provided physical exercise, which he believed essential to health, and which his temperament required. It gave him time alone with his thoughts, the meditative space that sustained his mental equilibrium. And by the time Washington returned from his ride, usually around 7 o'clock, breakfast was ready. This was typically a modest meal by Virginia standards: tea or coffee, corn cakes or bread, perhaps some cold meat or fish. Washington ate quickly and without excessive ceremony, treating breakfast as fuel for the day rather than a social occasion. The elaborate breakfasts that would become fashionable in later centuries were not his style. Efficiency trumped indulgence, and there was work to be done. After breakfast, Washington retreated to his study for what he considered the most important work of the day: correspondence. And here we arrive at one of the most remarkable aspects of his daily discipline: the sheer volume of letters he wrote, read, and organized over the course of his lifetime. Washington was, by any measure, one of the most prolific correspondents in American history. He wrote thousands of letters. Estimates range from 18,000 to 20,000 during his lifetime. And he kept copies of virtually all of them, creating an archive that historians have been mining ever since. The correspondence was not merely social, though Washington maintained extensive social connections through letters. It was administrative, political, agricultural, financial, and personal, often simultaneously. A single morning's work might include letters to overseers about crop rotations, to politicians about legislative matters, to merchants about supply orders, to family members about household concerns, and to friends about everything from horse breeding to philosophical questions. Each letter was composed with care, often drafted and revised before being copied in final form. Washington was acutely aware that his words might be preserved and scrutinized, and he wrote accordingly. His letter-writing process was systematic to the point of being almost industrial. He maintained files of incoming correspondence, organized by sender and date. He kept copies of outgoing letters in bound volumes that functioned as a permanent record of his communications. He employed secretaries to help with the volume of work, but he composed the most important letters himself, in his own distinctive handwriting that remained remarkably consistent throughout his life. The discipline required to maintain this system, the daily attention to paperwork that many people find tedious, was apparently not a burden for Washington. It was simply how things were done. The study where this work took place was Washington's command center, equipped with the tools he needed for effective administration. His desk, which still exists and can be seen at Mount Vernon, was designed for serious work. Large enough to spread out papers, sturdy enough to support the heavy volumes he consulted, positioned to catch the light from nearby windows. The room contained his books, his files, his maps, and all the apparatus of an 18th century executive office. It was here that Washington managed his estate, conducted his political correspondence, and planned the various projects that occupied his restless mind. The morning's correspondence work typically continued until around noon, when Washington would take a light midday meal. Dinner, the main meal of the day, was served in mid-afternoon, usually around 3 o'clock according to the customs of Virginia hospitality. If guests were present, which they almost always were, dinner could be an elaborate affair involving multiple courses, fine wines, and extended conversation. If the family was dining alone, the meal was simpler but still substantial. Either way, Washington used the dinner hour for social engagement as well as nourishment, discussing matters of interest with his guests and maintaining the relationships that were essential to his social and political position. The afternoon following dinner was typically devoted to further work, more correspondence, meetings with overseers, attention to whatever projects were currently underway. Washington did not rest after meals as many of his contemporaries did. He returned to work with the same energy he had brought to the morning's activities. The idea of an afternoon nap would have struck him as an inexcusable waste of time that could be better spent accomplishing something useful. Tea was served in the early evening, providing a break from work and an opportunity for lighter social interaction. Martha presided over the tea table, and the family and any guests would gather for conversation and refreshment. This was one of the more relaxed periods of Washington's day, a brief interlude between the afternoon's labours and the evening's activities. But even relaxation had its structure. The tea service followed established patterns, and the conversation, while pleasant, remained within the bounds of propriety that governed all Washington's social interactions. After tea, Washington would often take another ride or walk around the immediate grounds of Mount Vernon, checking on things that his morning circuit might have missed, and enjoying the late afternoon light on his beloved estate. These evening excursions were shorter than the morning rides, but served a similar purpose: physical activity, direct observation, and time alone with his thoughts. The combination of exercise and estate inspection was characteristic of Washington's approach to time management. Never do one thing when you can accomplish two things simultaneously. Supper, if served, was a light meal in the late evening, usually just bread and perhaps some butter or fruit. Washington was not a heavy eater by the standards of his era, when wealthy gentlemen often consumed enormous quantities of food and drink at every opportunity. He was moderate in his diet, believing that excess was harmful to health, and that self-discipline at the table reflected self-discipline in other areas of life. This moderation extended to alcohol as well. Washington drank wine with meals but rarely to excess, maintaining the control that was central to his self-image. The evening hours were often devoted to reading, particularly newspapers from various parts of the country that kept him informed about political developments, commercial news, and general affairs. Washington was an avid consumer of news, subscribing to multiple publications and reading them systematically to maintain awareness of what was happening beyond Mount Vernon's boundaries. This was not leisure reading, but intelligence gathering, the continuous information processing that effective leadership required. Bedtime came early by modern standards, but late by 18th century norms, usually around 9 o'clock, though it could be later if entertaining guests or attending social functions. Washington believed in adequate sleep and did not sacrifice rest for additional hours of productivity. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that the discipline of his days required the restoration that only proper sleep could provide. The man who rose at 4 in the morning needed to be in bed by 9 if he was to maintain his regimen without exhausting himself. It varied, of course, when circumstances required. The Revolutionary War and the presidency imposed very different schedules, but the underlying principles remained constant. Every day, the military precision of this routine was not coincidental. Washington had spent years in military service, where discipline and organization were matters of life and death. He had learned to plan operations carefully, to allocate resources efficiently, to maintain order amid chaos. These skills transferred naturally to civilian life, shaping his approach to estate management, correspondence, and daily activities. The same mind that could organize a military campaign could certainly organize a daily schedule, and Washington applied his organizational abilities to both with equal intensity. His record-keeping deserves particular attention, because it reveals something important about his approach to life and work. Washington kept records of everything, not just correspondence, but farm accounts, weather observations, household expenses, guest lists, and dozens of other categories of information. His diaries, maintained with varying consistency throughout his life, provide detailed accounts of daily activities, visitors received, and observations about everything from crop conditions to social encounters. This documentation was not merely habit. It was a systematic approach to life that made every experience potentially useful for future reference. The agricultural records are particularly impressive in their detail and consistency. Washington tracked yields from each field, noted the performance of different crops and cultivation methods, recorded weather conditions and their effects on farming operations, and maintained inventories of livestock, equipment, and supplies. This data allowed him to analyze the performance of his agricultural operations with something approaching scientific rigor, identifying patterns and making adjustments based on evidence rather than guesswork. Modern farm management software does essentially the same thing, but Washington accomplished it with quill pens and bound ledger books. The correspondence files served a similar function for his social and political activities. By keeping copies of his letters and organizing incoming correspondence systematically, Washington created a searchable archive of his communications that allowed him to track commitments, recall previous discussions, and maintain consistency in his dealings with others. He could consult his files to remember what he had written to a particular correspondent months or years earlier, ensuring that his current letters did not contradict his previous positions. This institutional memory, maintained through personal discipline rather than secretarial assistance, gave Washington a significant advantage in the complex negotiations of political and social life. The physical rising before dawn, riding for hours, working through the day, engaging in social activities in the evening, This schedule would exhaust most modern people, even with our climate-controlled buildings and labour-saving devices. Washington maintained it for decades, into his 60s, with apparently undiminished energy. His physical constitution must have been extraordinary, combining natural stamina with the conditioning that came from years of active life. The tall, strong body that made such an impression on contemporaries was not merely decorative. It was a working machine that supported the intense demands of his chosen lifestyle. The mental discipline required was equally impressive. Washington's mind had to track dozens of ongoing projects, hundreds of social and professional relationships, thousands of details about his estate and his various responsibilities. He had to compose thoughtful letters on complex subjects, make decisions about agricultural experiments and building projects, navigate political controversies with careful precision. All of this required sustained mental effort that many people would find impossible to maintain. Yet Washington did maintain it day after day, year after year, treating mental work with the same systematic approach he applied to everything else. The role of habit in sustaining this discipline cannot be overstated. Washington's routine was not something he decided to follow each morning. It was something he simply did, automatically, because he had done it so many times before. The early rising, the morning ride, the correspondence work, these activities were grooves worn into his consciousness through repetition, requiring no daily decision or motivational effort. The discipline was not willpower, but habit, and habit is far more sustainable than willpower over the long term. This habitual discipline also extended to his personal conduct. Washington's famous self-control, his ability to maintain composure under pressure, to regulate his expressions and emotions, to present a consistent public face regardless of his internal state, was similarly a product of long practice. He had trained himself to behave in certain ways, and the training had become so deeply embedded that it required little conscious effort. The controlled, dignified Washington that contemporaries observed was not performing self-discipline. He was simply being himself, because self-discipline had become the core of who he was. The pedantic attention to detail that characterized Washington's record-keeping and correspondence also reflected his understanding of how small things accumulated into large ones. A letter carelessly written might damage a relationship or create a misunderstanding. A farm record poorly maintained might lead to inefficient decisions. A daily routine loosely followed might gradually deteriorate into chaos. Washington understood that excellence was built from consistent attention to detail, and he paid that attention relentlessly. This brings us to a quality that historians sometimes call Washington's untiring industry: his seemingly inexhaustible capacity for work. He simply never stopped working, or rather, he did not experience work the way many people do, as something to be endured until the release of leisure. For Washington, work was satisfaction, productivity was pleasure, accomplishment was its own reward. He worked hard because working hard was how he achieved the goals that gave his life meaning, and he saw no reason to work less hard when there was always more to be done. The contrast with modern attitudes toward work and leisure is striking. We tend to think of work as something to be minimized, leisure as something to be maximized, the ideal life as one with as little obligation and as much freedom as possible. Washington would have found this attitude incomprehensible. For him, the good life was the productive life, and productivity required constant effort sustained over time. This is not to say that Washington did not value leisure or enjoy relaxation. As we have discussed, he took genuine pleasure in dancing, theatre, horses, and social interaction. But Washington did not work so that he could play. He played in ways that made his work more effective. The implications of Washington's discipline for his achievements are difficult to overstate. His success in military command depended on organizational abilities honed through years of systematic practice. His effectiveness as president relied on the administrative skills he had developed managing Mount Vernon. His reputation for reliability and consistency, the trust that others placed in him, was built through decades of doing what he said he would do, when he said he would do it, without fail. The man who could not be trusted to maintain a daily routine could hardly be trusted to lead a nation. The personal cost of this discipline is harder to assess. Washington's routine left a little room for spontaneity, for the unplanned pleasures that make life interesting, for the looseness and flexibility that many people find essential to happiness. He was, in some sense, a prisoner of his own habits, bound to a pattern of life that he had chosen but could not easily escape. Whether he experienced this as constraint or as freedom, the freedom that comes from knowing exactly what each day will bring, is impossible to determine from the historical record. What we can say is that Washington's discipline was self-imposed rather than externally enforced. He chose this life, maintained it through his own efforts, and apparently found it satisfying. The routine that might seem oppressive to outside observers was, for Washington, simply the natural way to live. He was not fighting against his nature but expressing it, following the inclinations of a mind that genuinely preferred order to chaos, productivity to idleness, system to randomness. The hours of the day at Mount Vernon passed in their appointed rhythm, each one allocated to its designated purpose, each one contributing to the larger pattern of a life lived with intention and discipline. The man who would lead armies and preside over nations first learned to lead himself, to preside over his own time and activities with the same authority he would later exercise on larger stages. As we near the end of our exploration of Washington's daily discipline, we might reflect on what it teaches us about the relationship between greatness and routine. The extraordinary achievements that made Washington famous were built on a foundation of ordinary days, each one structured and productive, each one contributing its small increment to the larger whole. There was no magic in Washington's success, no secret formula or hidden advantage. There was only discipline, sustained, systematic, and seemingly inexhaustible, applied day after day for an entire lifetime. The fire burns lower now, and we have spent this chapter in the company of Washington's routine, following him from pre-dawn rising to evening retirement, from morning ride to afternoon correspondence to evening reading. It is a demanding schedule, not for the faint of heart or the easily distracted, but it is also a comprehensible one, a human-scale approach to life that anyone could theoretically adopt if they possessed the discipline to maintain it. Washington possessed that discipline, and it served him well through all the challenges and opportunities that his extraordinary life presented. The routine was his foundation, his constant amid change, the reliable structure upon which everything else was built. And now, having understood something of how he organized his days, we can better appreciate how he accomplished what he did with those days. The story continues forward, with final chapters yet to explore about places of retreat and the peaceful moments before history's storms arrived. But the rhythm of Washington's life, that steady, disciplined pulse that drove everything else, now accompanies us as we move toward our conclusion. But let us linger a while longer with this theme of discipline, because there is more to explore in the relationship between Washington's routine and his character. The daily schedule we have examined was not merely a productivity technique, it was an expression of values, a physical manifestation of what Washington believed about how life should be lived. Consider, for instance, his attitude toward punctuality. Washington was famously, almost obsessively, on time. He expected dinner to be served at precisely the appointed hour, regardless of whether guests had arrived. Visitors who came late found that the meal had proceeded without them, not out of rudeness, Washington would have explained, but out of respect for those who had arrived on time and for the household staff who had prepared the food. Time, in Washington's view, was a resource too valuable to waste waiting for people who could not manage their own schedules. This punctuality extended to all his appointments and commitments. When Washington said he would be somewhere at a particular time, he was there. When he promised to complete a task by a certain date, he completed it. This reliability became part of his reputation. People knew they could count on Washington to do what he said he would do, and it served him well in contexts where trust was essential. A commander whose soldiers could rely on him, a president whose allies could depend on him, a businessman whose partners could trust him. These advantages grew directly from the discipline of punctuality that Washington maintained in all his dealings. The household at Mount Vernon operated according to this same principle of clockwork regularity. Meals were served at fixed times. Work began and ended according to established schedules. The rhythm of the day was predictable enough that everyone, family members, servants, enslaved workers, knew what to expect and could organize their own activities accordingly. This predictability was not rigidity for its own sake. It was efficiency, allowing a complex household to function smoothly by establishing clear expectations and consistent patterns. Martha played an essential role in maintaining this household discipline, as we have discussed, but the underlying vision was George's. He believed that order was the foundation of accomplishment, that chaos was the enemy of productivity, that structure was liberating rather than constraining, because it freed the mind from endless small decisions about what to do next. When every hour had its appointed purpose, one did not waste mental energy deciding how to spend time. One simply followed the plan and accomplished what needed to be accomplished. This philosophy of structured time management reflected deeper beliefs about human nature and moral development. Washington believed that character was built through discipline, that good habits cultivated through repetition eventually became second nature, that the person one appeared to be was, over time, the person one actually became. His daily routine was not just a method for getting things done, it was a technology for self-improvement, a way of shaping his own character through the accumulated weight of countless disciplined days. Writing letters in the 18th century was not like sending emails today. There was no autocorrect, no ability to easily delete and revise, no instant transmission that allowed for casual back-and-forth communication. Each letter had to be composed carefully, often drafted on rough paper before being copied in final form. Mistakes could not be easily corrected, and the physical act of writing was slow enough that every word represented a significant investment of time. Washington's letters reflect this reality in their careful construction and deliberate phrasing. He chose his words with precision, aware that what he wrote might be preserved and scrutinized. He organized his thoughts before putting pen to paper, knowing that rambling or disorganized letters would reflect poorly on him. He maintained consistency across his correspondence, ensuring that what he wrote to one person did not contradict what he had written to another. This required not just good writing habits, but a remarkable memory for what he had said to whom, supplemented by the filing system that allowed him to consult previous letters when necessary. The volume of correspondence is staggering when you consider the time required for each letter. Washington wrote multiple letters most days, sometimes dozens during particularly busy periods. Each one required attention to content, tone, handwriting, and the physical materials of communication. Paper, ink, sealing wax, the address that would guide the letter to its destination. Multiply this by thousands of letters over decades, and you begin to appreciate the scope of Washington's epistolary discipline. The content of the letters reveals a mind engaged with an enormous range of subjects. Agricultural matters predominated during his years at Mount Vernon. Questions of crop selection, soil management, livestock breeding, and the endless challenges of running a large farming operation. Political correspondence increased during and after the Revolution, as Washington navigated the complex relationships and controversies of national life. Personal letters to family and friends showed a warmer, more relaxed side of his personality, though even these maintained the dignity and propriety that characterized all his communications. Business correspondence dealt with the financial matters that occupied much of any wealthy planter's attention: purchases and sales, debts and credits, contracts and agreements. Washington was actively involved in various commercial ventures beyond farming, and managing these interests required regular communication with partners, agents, and suppliers. He tracked his finances carefully, maintained records of all transactions, and expected prompt and accurate accounting from those who handled his business affairs. The discipline required to maintain this volume of correspondence while also managing an estate, entertaining guests, pursuing his passions, and eventually serving in military and political roles is almost impossible to imagine from a modern perspective. We have tools that Washington lacked: computers, telephones, rapid transportation, institutional support. Yet most of us would struggle to maintain correspondence at a fraction of his volume. The difference was not intelligence or natural ability. It was discipline, the systematic application of time and effort to tasks that others might neglect or defer. Washington's approach to his correspondence also reflected his understanding of relationships and reputation. He knew that letters were a primary means of maintaining connections in an era when face-to-face contact was limited by slow and difficult travel. A letter could keep a friendship alive across hundreds of miles and many months of separation. A letter could build political alliances, conduct business negotiations, or resolve family disputes. The person who neglected correspondence risked being forgotten, excluded from the networks of information and influence that shaped 18th century life. His reputation for prompt and thoughtful responses to correspondence enhanced his standing in these networks. People knew that writing to Washington would produce a reply, not immediately, given the pace of mail delivery, but reliably, within a reasonable time. This reliability made him a valued correspondent, someone worth staying in touch with because the relationship would be reciprocated. The discipline of answering letters was thus not just personal productivity, but social investment, building and maintaining the relationships that supported his various enterprises. The filing system that preserved Washington's correspondence deserves recognition as an achievement in itself. He maintained copies of his outgoing letters, no small task when each copy had to be made by hand, and organized incoming correspondence in ways that allowed for efficient retrieval. This archive became a resource that supported his work throughout his life and has supported historical research ever since. The decision to preserve these records and the discipline to maintain the system consistently over decades reflects the same systematic approach that characterized all of Washington's activities. Beyond correspondence, Washington's daily work included what we might call executive functions, making decisions, giving instructions, solving problems that arose in the management of his various enterprises. These activities are harder to document than letter writing because they often occurred in person or left no written record, but they were essential to his effectiveness, and they required their own forms of discipline and organization. Decision-making, in particular, was something Washington approached with characteristic deliberation. He gathered information from multiple sources, considered alternatives carefully, sought advice from people whose judgment he trusted, and made decisions only when he felt adequately informed. This process could be frustratingly slow to those who wanted quick answers, but it produced decisions that were generally sound and that Washington could defend if challenged. The discipline of deliberation prevented the hasty mistakes that faster decision-makers sometimes committed. Once decisions were made, Washington's discipline shifted to implementation and follow-up. He gave clear instructions, established expectations for results, and monitored progress to ensure that decisions were actually carried out. This follow-through was essential. Many people make good decisions that fail because they are never properly implemented. Washington understood that a decision was only the beginning, that the hard work of execution determined whether good intentions produced good outcomes. His management of the enslaved workforce at Mount Vernon illustrates this approach to implementation, though it also illustrates the moral failures we discussed earlier. Washington gave detailed instructions to his overseers, specified expectations for work output, and held people accountable for results. This hands-on management style was demanding for everyone involved, but it produced results that looser oversight would not have achieved. The same Washington gathered intelligence, deliberated on strategy, made decisions about troop movements and engagements, and then followed up relentlessly to ensure that orders were carried out. The presidency imposed yet another set of demands on Washington's disciplinary capacities. Now he was managing not a plantation or an army, but a nation, dealing with challenges that range from international diplomacy to domestic controversy to the establishment of precedents that would shape American government for centuries. The skills he brought to this task were the same skills he had developed and refined throughout his life: systematic organization, deliberate decision-making, careful communication, and relentless follow-through. Throughout all these roles and responsibilities, Washington maintained the daily routines that anchored his life. The early rising, the physical exercise, the structured work hours, the careful record-keeping, these habits persisted even when the specific content of his work changed dramatically. The routine was flexible enough to accommodate different circumstances, but consistent enough to provide the stability that sustained him through years of challenge and change. The question of how Washington maintained this discipline over such a long period is worth considering. Most people find that their resolve weakens over time, that habits established with enthusiasm gradually erode under the pressure of competing demands and simple fatigue. Washington somehow avoided this erosion, maintaining his disciplinary practices with remarkable consistency from young adulthood into old age. What enabled this sustained commitment? Part of the answer may lie in Washington's fundamental temperament. Some people simply find order and routine more satisfying than others, deriving genuine pleasure from the completion of tasks and the maintenance of systems. Washington appears to have been one of these people. His discipline was not white-knuckle effort against contrary inclinations, but natural expression of who he was. The routine that might have felt like imprisonment to someone else felt like home to Washington. Another part of the answer may lie in the rewards his discipline produced. Washington's systematic approach to life generated visible results: a prosperous estate, a successful military career, a respected position in society, and eventually the leadership of a nation. These results reinforced the behaviors that produced them, creating a positive feedback loop in which discipline led to success, which motivated further discipline. People generally continue doing what works, and Washington's disciplinary practices worked extremely well. The social context also supported his discipline in important ways. Virginia gentry culture valued certain forms of self-control and systematic behavior, providing external reinforcement for the internal inclinations Washington possessed. His marriage to Martha created a household environment organized around shared values of productivity and order. The people he surrounded himself with, his aides, his overseers, his correspondents, were generally people who shared or at least respected his approach to life. This supportive context made maintaining discipline easier than it would have been in isolation or opposition. Finally, Washington's sense of duty and purpose provided motivation that transcended personal comfort or convenience. He believed that he had responsibilities to fulfill to his family, to his estate, to his community, and eventually to his nation, and these responsibilities demanded the sustained effort that his disciplinary practices made possible. The routine was not merely a method for personal productivity, it was a means of honoring obligations that Washington took seriously. Abandoning discipline would have meant abandoning duty, and that was something Washington could not contemplate. As we conclude this examination of Washington's daily discipline, we carry with us an image of a man who mastered time by organizing it, who achieved extraordinary things through the accumulation of ordinary days, who built greatness on a foundation of routine. This is not the romantic image of genius striking like lightning, producing flashes of brilliance that illuminate the darkness. It is the steadier image of sustained effort, day after day, year after year, building something large through countless small contributions. The night continues its course, and we move toward the final chapters of our exploration. But Washington's discipline accompanies us now, a model of what sustained commitment can accomplish, a reminder that the extraordinary often emerges from the ordinary, properly organized and persistently pursued. The clocks of Mount Vernon mark time with the same steady rhythm that governed Washington's days, each tick bringing the next task, each hour bringing its appointed duties. In that rhythm, in that discipline, lay the foundation of everything Washington became and everything he accomplished. The story moves forward, but the lesson remains. And what a lesson it is, this glimpse into the daily mechanics of a life that would shape history. We tend to remember Washington for the dramatic moments, crossing the Delaware, presiding over the Constitutional Convention, taking the oath of office as the first president. But those dramatic moments emerge from countless undramatic ones, from mornings that began before dawn and evenings spent reviewing correspondence, from rides across muddy fields and afternoons managing difficult people, from the accumulated weight of days spent in productive routine. The discipline that made Washington great was not glamorous. It was getting up early when staying in bed would have been easier. It was writing another letter when the stack of correspondence seemed endless. It was riding out in cold rain to inspect fields that needed attention. It was maintaining records that no one would read for centuries, on the chance that someday someone might need them. It was doing what needed to be done day after day without fanfare or recognition, trusting that the results would eventually justify the effort. This is perhaps the most important thing we can learn from examining Washington's daily routine, that greatness is built in small increments, through disciplined attention to ordinary tasks. There is no shortcut, no sudden leap from obscurity to achievement. There is only the steady accumulation of productive days, each one adding its small contribution to the larger whole. Washington understood this truth and organized his life around it. He did not wait for inspiration or motivation. He simply worked, trusting that consistent effort would produce results even when results were not immediately visible. He did not expect each day to be memorable. He expected each day to be useful, adding its increment to the progress he sought. For those of us listening in the quiet hours, this lesson may be both encouraging and challenging. Encouraging, because it suggests that the kind of discipline Washington displayed is not reserved for the naturally gifted or the specially favoured. It is available to anyone willing to do the work day after day with patience and persistence. Challenging because it demands exactly that work, not occasional bursts of effort but sustained commitment over time. The fire burns low as this chapter concludes. Washington's day at Mount Vernon has unfolded before us, from pre-dawn rising to evening retirement, from morning ride to afternoon correspondence to the quiet hours before sleep. It was a full day, a productive day, a day like thousands of others in his life, unremarkable in itself, extraordinary only in its multiplication across decades of disciplined living. The rhythm continues as we move toward our final chapters. But now we know something important about how Washington lived, how he organized his time, how he built the foundation on which all his achievements rested. The routine was his secret, if it can be called a secret, the unglamorous truth that greatness emerges from discipline sustained over time. Hold that thought as we continue our journey through Washington's private life. The places of retreat and the moments of peace still await us, and then the story will be complete. Every public figure needs a place to hide, a place where the mask can slip, where the performance can pause, where the exhausting work of being watched can finally stop. For George Washington, a man who spent most of his adult life under scrutiny of one kind or another. These places of solitude were not luxuries but necessities, refuges where the private self could breathe freely, away from the expectations that pressed upon him from every direction. The most obvious of these refuges was Mount Vernon itself. Though calling an 8,000-acre estate with constant visitors a refuge requires some qualification. Mount Vernon was home, certainly, and Washington felt more himself there than anywhere else. But even at home, the demands of hospitality and management meant that true solitude was hard to find. Guests arrived constantly, sometimes invited, sometimes not, and the duties of a Virginia gentleman required that they be entertained. The household staff, the enslaved workers, the family members and relatives who seemed to populate every corner, all of these presences made complete privacy difficult to achieve. Yet Washington found his moments of solitude even within this crowded environment, carving out spaces and times that belonged to him alone. The early morning hours before the household stirred offered one such opportunity. Rising at 4 o'clock, Washington had 2 or 3 hours before anyone else was likely to demand his attention. Time for reading, reflection, and the quiet ordering of thoughts that the day's activities would soon scatter. These pre-dawn hours were perhaps his most private, a pocket of stillness in the otherwise relentless flow of obligations. The morning rides that we have discussed served a similar function. On horseback, moving across his estate in the early light, Washington was alone with his thoughts in a way that indoor life rarely permitted. Yes, he was inspecting crops and checking on workers, but he was also communing with the land he loved, experiencing the physical pleasure of riding, and enjoying the solitude that the fields and forests provided. The workers he encountered along the way would have addressed him briefly and returned to their tasks. They were not companions, but scenery, present, but not intrusive. The study at Mount Vernon was another retreat, though one more associated with work than with rest. Here Washington conducted his correspondence, managed his accounts, and attended to the administrative tasks that filled so much of his time. The study was his domain, arranged according to his preferences and equipped with the tools he needed. When he retreated there, the household understood that he was not to be disturbed except for matters of genuine importance. This understood boundary created a kind of privacy even within a busy house, a room where Washington could work without interruption, think without distraction, and be alone with his papers and his thoughts. But perhaps the most significant places of solitude were not rooms or fields, but moments. Brief intervals when Washington could step away from whatever role he was playing and simply be himself. These moments might occur during a walk around the grounds, a pause between meetings, a few minutes of evening quiet before the household gathered for supper. They were not scheduled or planned, they emerged opportunistically, grabbed when circumstances permitted and relinquished when duty called. The psychological importance of these moments of solitude is difficult to overstate. Washington spent most of his life performing the role of Virginia gentleman, performing the role of military commander, performing the role of president. Each of these performances required sustained attention to appearance, behavior, and speech. The famous self-control that characterized Washington's public demeanor was not effortless. It was work, demanding constant vigilance and energy. The moments of solitude provided relief from this work, allowing Washington to relax the control, drop the performance, and simply exist without an audience. What did Washington do in these moments of solitude? What did the private self look like when no one was watching? These questions are difficult to answer with certainty, because by definition the private moments left few records. But we can make some inferences from what we know of his character and interests. He probably thought about his estate, the projects underway, the problems that needed solving, the improvements he hoped to make. Mount Vernon was never far from his mind, and the solitary moments may have been when he did his best thinking about agricultural experiments, building plans, and the endless details of management. The disciplined routine we discussed in the previous chapter was one expression of this constant mental engagement. The solitary moments were another, providing space for the reflection that informed his decisions. He probably also thought about the people in his life, Martha, the children and grandchildren, the friends and associates who populated his world. Relationships required attention that busy schedules often prevented. The solitary moments may have been when Washington considered how to handle difficult situations, what to say in important conversations, how to maintain connections that mattered to him. The correspondence that consumed so much of his working time was the visible product of this relational thinking. But the thinking itself happened in quieter moments. And Washington was intensely concerned with his reputation, with the image he projected to the world, with the legacy he would leave behind. This concern required ongoing self-assessment, a continuous monitoring of his own behaviour against the standards he had set for himself. The solitary moments provided opportunity for this self-examination, away from the external pressures that might distort his judgment. The gap between public persona and private self that Washington navigated was substantial, though perhaps not as large as it might have been for a less disciplined person. The self-control he displayed in public was not entirely a mask. It was, as we have discussed, an expression of values he genuinely held and habits he had genuinely developed. But it was still a performance, requiring effort that could not be sustained indefinitely. The private Washington was presumably somewhat more relaxed, somewhat less guarded, somewhat more willing to express emotions and opinions that the public Washington kept carefully contained. Martha would have known this private Washington better than anyone. In the intimacy of their marriage, the public mask could safely slip, revealing the person beneath the performance. Washington could express frustration, voice doubts, admit vulnerabilities that he would never have acknowledged to anyone else. Martha's role as confidant was perhaps as important as her role as household manager. She provided a safe audience for the private self that had no other outlet. The physical places of solitude at Mount Vernon have been studied and preserved, allowing modern visitors to see something of where Washington retreated from public life. His study, with its desk and books and carefully organized files, offers one window into his private world. The piazza overlooking the Potomac, where he and Martha would sit in the evenings watching the river and the distant shore, offers another. The grounds themselves, with their winding paths and strategic vistas, were designed partly for the pleasure of walking alone, contemplating the beauty Washington had worked so hard to create. But the most important places of solitude were internal rather than external, the mental spaces where Washington could think freely, feel fully, and exist without performance. These spaces travelled with him wherever he went, available during military campaigns and political crises as well as during peaceful years at Mount Vernon. The discipline that structured his external life also protected these internal spaces, creating boundaries that even the most demanding circumstances could not entirely breach. During the Revolutionary War, for instance, Washington found moments of solitude despite the constant pressure of command. He retreated to his tent for private reflection, took solitary rides to survey terrain and escape the demands of headquarters, and maintained the early rising habit that gave him quiet hours before the day's activities began. These moments were briefer and more precarious than the solitude available at Mount Vernon, but they served the same essential function, providing space for the private self to breathe. The presidency imposed similar constraints and required similar adaptations. In New York and Philadelphia, surrounded by staff and visitors and the endless demands of the new office, Washington had to work harder to find moments of solitude. But he found them in early morning hours, in carriage rides through the city, in the brief intervals between appointments. The discipline of seeking solitude, developed over a lifetime, served him well in circumstances that might have overwhelmed someone less practiced in protecting private space. The relationship between public persona and private self is a challenge that any prominent person must navigate, and Washington navigated it with unusual skill. He understood that the public needed to see certain things from him: dignity, steadiness, the calm confidence that inspired trust, and he provided those things consistently, year after year, regardless of what he might have been feeling internally. But he also understood that he could not sustain this performance without relief, that the private self needed expression even if that expression had to be carefully hidden from public view. The places of solitude were where this private expression occurred, where Washington could set down the burden of public expectation and simply be. They were not escapes from reality, but returns to it, moments when the performance stopped and the authentic self emerged. Without these moments, the performance could not have continued. The mask would have cracked, the control would have failed, the man beneath would have been revealed in ways that might have damaged the public figure. This is perhaps the most human thing we can say about George Washington. He needed privacy as much as anyone else, needed moments when he could stop being the symbol and simply be the man. The places of solitude that provided these moments were essential to his functioning, not luxuries but necessities that he protected throughout his life. The public Washington that history remembers was made possible by the private Washington that history rarely saw. The man who retreated to his study, who rode alone across his fields, who sat quietly with Martha as evening fell over the Potomac. The year is 1759. George Washington, 27 years old, has just married one of the wealthiest widows in Virginia and taken up residence at Mount Vernon. The French and Indian War, in which he served with distinction and occasional disaster, is winding down. The political controversies that will eventually lead to revolution are still years away, barely visible clouds on a distant horizon. For this brief moment, perhaps the only such moment in his adult life, George Washington is at peace. Let us pause here, at this quiet juncture, and appreciate what this young man does not yet know about his future. He does not know that he will command an army against the most powerful empire on earth. He does not know that he will become the first president of a nation that does not yet exist. He does not know that his name will be given to a capital city, to a state, to countless streets and schools and monuments across a continent he has barely begun to explore. He knows only that he is a Virginia planter, newly married, settling into the life he has always wanted, a life of agricultural improvement, social advancement, and domestic contentment. The irony is almost too neat for fiction. Here is a man who will be remembered for his public service, who will sacrifice decades of his life to military and political duties he never sought. And in 1759, his greatest ambition is to be a successful farmer. He has seen war and found it wanting. The military career that might have been his path to distinction has proven frustrating and unrewarding. He has resigned his commission, married well, and turned his attention to the peaceful pursuits that he believes will define his future. The revolution that will claim him is still 16 years away, and he has no reason to anticipate it. This moment of peaceful anticipation is worth dwelling on, because it humanizes Washington in ways that his later fame tends to obscure. In 1759, he was not the marble monument we have inherited. He wanted to expand Mount Vernon, to improve his agricultural operations, to rise in Virginia society, to build a happy life with his new wife. Nothing in his circumstances suggested that he would become anything more than what he already was. A prosperous planter, respected in his community, successful by the standards of his time and place. The domestic happiness that Washington found with Martha in these early years was genuine and significant. As we have explored in previous chapters, their marriage evolved from practical arrangement to genuine partnership, providing both of them with companionship and support that neither had fully expected. The household they established at Mount Vernon functioned smoothly under Martha's management, while George threw himself into the agricultural improvements that would occupy him for the rest of his life. They entertained guests, attended social functions, participated in the life of Virginia gentry society. It was a good life, and Washington had every reason to believe it would continue. The children, Jackie and Patsy, added both joy and concern to the household. Jackie's educational challenges were already becoming apparent, but there was still hope that he might mature into the serious young man his stepfather wished him to become. Patsy's epilepsy had not yet reached the severity that would eventually claim her life. She was still a sweet-tempered child whose condition, while worrying, did not yet dominate the household's attention. The family that Washington had joined through marriage felt like a real family, with all the ordinary complications and satisfactions that families provide. Mount Vernon itself was in the early stages of the transformation that would eventually make it one of Virginia's finest estates. The modest house that Washington had inherited was being expanded and improved. The agricultural operations were being reorganized and modernized. The grounds were being landscaped according to the fashionable English style. Every improvement represented an investment in a future that Washington expected to spend here, building something that would last for generations. The political situation in 1759 gave little hint of the upheavals to come. The British Empire was triumphant in North America, having defeated France in the war that Washington had helped to fight. The relationship between the colonies and the mother country seemed stable, even harmonious. Virginians were proud to be British subjects, loyal to the crown, and largely satisfied with their place in the imperial system. The taxes and regulations that would eventually provoke rebellion were still years in the future. The ideas of independence and revolution barely whispered even among the most radical thinkers. Washington himself showed no signs of revolutionary inclination in 1759. He was a loyal British subject, proud of his military service to the crown, eager to advance within the existing social and political system rather than to overthrow it. His frustrations with British military hierarchy during the war had been personal rather than ideological. He resented being treated as inferior to regular British officers, but this resentment did not translate into opposition to British rule. He wanted respect within the system, not destruction of the system. The revolutionary who would later risk everything for independence was, in 1759, a conventional Virginia gentleman with conventional Virginia ambitions. The transformation that would turn this loyal subject into a revolutionary leader is one of history's great mysteries, or rather, it is one of history's great demonstrations of how circumstances can shape individuals in unexpected ways. Washington did not become a revolutionary because he was born one. He became a revolutionary because the situation demanded it, because the principles he believed in came into conflict with the policies of the empire he had served. The peaceful planter of 1759 contained within himself the potential for the revolutionary commander of 1775, but that potential required specific circumstances to be realized. As 1759 drew to a close and the Washington household settled into its new routines, nothing suggested that these circumstances would ever arise. The young couple looked forward to years of domestic happiness, agricultural improvement, and gradual social advancement. They planned expansions to the house, experimented with new crops, entertained the steady stream of visitors that Virginia hospitality required. They were building a life, brick by brick and field by field, with no expectation that larger forces would eventually sweep that life into the current of world history. The peacefulness of this moment deserves emphasis precisely because it was so brief and so rare in Washington's life. Before 1759, he had spent years in military service, enduring the hardships and dangers of frontier warfare. After 1775, he would spend decades in public service, bearing burdens that would have crushed most people. Only these few years between, roughly 1759 to 1774, offered anything resembling the peaceful private life that Washington claimed to prefer. And even these years were not entirely peaceful, marked as they were by family sorrows, political frustrations, and the endless demands of managing a large estate. But compared to what came before and what would come after, this period was an island of relative calm in a stormy life. Washington could wake each morning knowing approximately what the day would bring, could plan seasons ahead without wondering whether war or revolution would disrupt his calculations, could focus his attention on the immediate concerns of family and farm without the weight of historical significance pressing upon him. This was the life he had chosen, and the life he wanted, not the life that history would eventually impose upon him. The contrast between this peaceful interlude and the tumultuous decades that followed raises interesting questions about fate, choice, and the forces that shape individual lives. Was Washington destined for greatness, his exceptional qualities inevitably drawing him toward exceptional responsibilities? Or was he simply a capable man in the right place at the right time, elevated by circumstances that might equally have elevated someone else? The peaceful planter of 1759 suggests the second interpretation. Here was a man who wanted nothing more than to cultivate his fields and enjoy his family, with no apparent ambition for the world historical role that awaited him. Yet something in Washington responded when duty called, some combination of character and capability that made him the right person for the challenges that arose. The farmer became a general, the planter became a president, not by abandoning who he was, but by applying who he was to challenges he had never anticipated. The year 1759 was thus both an ending and a beginning, the end of Washington's military career and the beginning of his domestic life, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another that would eventually lead to chapters no one could have foreseen. The young man, and now the fire. We have seen the passions and contradictions, the relationships and routines, the private man behind the public monument. What remains? Not the marble Washington of monuments and currency, but the living man we have come to know, the farmer who loved his land, the husband who found unexpected love in a practical marriage, the stepfather who tried his best with children who challenged him, the horseman who found peace on early morning rides, the disciplined planner who structured his days with military precision, the private person who needed solitude to sustain the public performance. This Washington is more interesting than the monument, more human than the legend, more instructive than the icon. He was a man who lived fully in his time while somehow transcending it, who achieved extraordinary things while remaining recognizably ordinary in his needs and desires. He wanted what most people want: love, respect, meaningful work, a comfortable home, and he got those things, along with responsibilities he never sought, and a place in history he never expected. The peaceful interlude of 1759 is where we leave him, poised at the threshold of a life that will exceed anything he can imagine. The revolution is still distant, the presidency unthinkable, the monuments and memories still far in the future. For now there is only Mount Vernon, only Martha, only the satisfying work of building a life one day at a time. The fire dies to embers, and the Virginia night wraps around the house on the hill above the Potomac. Somewhere in that house, George and Martha Washington are settling into sleep, tired from another full day of the ordinary activities that fill their lives. They do not know what is coming. They cannot know. They know only that they are together, that they are home, that tomorrow will bring more of the same productive routine that structures their existence. Let that image carry you into sleep, the young couple at Mount Vernon, the house quiet around them, the future unknown and unimaginable. They are at peace for this brief moment, and peace is precious precisely because it is rare. The storms will come, but not tonight. Tonight, and now it is time for you to join them. We have travelled together through the private world of George Washington F.